The first warning usually came from the housekeeper, not from the hostess, not from the family butler or the steward or anyone with a formal professional relationship to the preparations that a royal visit required. From the housekeeper, always. She would arrive at the house a day or two before Queen Mary was expected, and she would move through the principal rooms without apparent urgency, pausing in front of certain objects with an attention that her hostess sometimes noticed and sometimes did not. She did not make notes. She did not point or gesture. She looked, with the specific quality of looking that people who have been trained by a particular kind of attention develop over years, and then she left. And by the following morning, things had vanished. A bracket clock that had stood on the library mantelpiece since the 1820s, purchased by the grandfather of the current owner at a sale in Bath, noted in the household inventory of 1827, present in 3 different family portraits, gone. A pair of Chinese export porcelain figures, their provenance uncertain, but their presence entirely certain, there in the drawing room, when the hostess's own grandmother had lived in the house, still there the day before the housekeeper arrived, not there the morning after. A small oval portrait miniature, a woman in late Georgian dress with a complacent expression and a good chain, sitting among other small things on a side table, where small things accumulate over the decades, there one morning and absent the next. Not stolen. The word implies illegality, and there was nothing illegal about any of it. Moved. Hidden in bedrooms that the Queen was unlikely to enter, pushed behind screens in secondary sitting rooms, placed at the backs of closets that would not be opened during a royal visit, because the staff of the house, or the senior members of the family, who had either experienced or heard accounts of previous visits, had learned through painful and specific education what happened when Queen Mary admired something. If you are new here, this channel covers the private lives of the British royal family in the kind of detail that official biographies are careful to leave in their footnotes. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. Stories like this one are what this channel is built on, and there are more of them than you have yet been told. She did not demand. She did not reach out and take. There was nothing in her behavior that could have been described, at the time or in retrospect, as aggressive or acquisitive in any legible form. What she did was considerably more subtle than any of that, and in some ways considerably more difficult to resist, because it had no form that you could refuse. She would pause in front of the object. Her head would incline, slightly, in the specific way of someone whose attention has been genuinely engaged rather than performed. Her eyes would settle on it, with the quality of a person reading, rather than looking, assessing the thing's entire history through the surface of its glaze, or the grain of its gilding, or the weight that 4 generations of careful ownership gives to a piece of furniture. She had spent more time than anyone else in the country acquiring the ability to read objects this way. She was, by any honest measure, exceptionally good at it. Then she would say, in a mild and conversational voice that carried no explicit weight whatsoever, "How very handsome," and she would look at whoever owned it. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds. 2 seconds is long enough, in the right social configuration, to contain everything that needs to be understood without being stated. The person being looked at would smile, because smiling was the available response in that configuration. They would agree that yes, it was rather handsome. The Queen would nod with the mild satisfaction of someone whose judgment has been confirmed by the record, and the conversation would move on to tea or the garden or the children's progress, or any of the dozen other topics that a royal visit required. And the object would arrive at Marlborough House 3 weeks later, in a crate, with a polite note of presentation. The note would be signed by the owner of the house. The owner of the house, when asked by their children or their heirs how this had come about, would find it difficult to explain in terms that made logical sense. There had been no explicit request. There had been no moment at which refusal had presented itself as an available option. There had been, in retrospect, only the 2 seconds of the look and the mild statement and the smile that meant the matter was settled, and the matter had been settled. This was how she operated, across a span of 60 years and an unknowable number of drawing rooms. Not with commands. Not with the kind of pressure that can be identified and resisted. With the pressure that does not take any explicit form. The pressure of being looked at by someone whose assessment of your social and institutional responsibilities is more precise than your own, and who has communicated, in 2 seconds, that she knows what the correct thing to do is. Once you understand that she knows, the only remaining question is whether you will do it. And most people, in most situations, did. She operated this way across country houses in England, and foreign palaces on the continent, and hospital wards in wartime London, and the long formal corridors of a monarchy that outlasted everything the 20th century threw at it, and the 20th century threw a considerable amount. She was the wife of George V, and the mother of Edward V, and the mother of George VI, and the grandmother of Elizabeth II. She sat at the centre of British royal life from 1893 to her death in 1953, a period of 60 years during which the British monarchy faced the abdication crisis, 2 world wars, the German anti-royalist feeling that required the family to change its name, the death of an empire, the transformation of a constitutional monarchy into something different from what it had been when she arrived at it as a young bride. She saw all of it. She managed most of it, in the quiet and unacknowledged way that the people who manage institutions, rather than lead them, tend to manage. From slightly to the side of the visible center, never claiming the credit for the work, because claiming credit was not how the work got done. The people who knew her well, or who worked for her, or married into her family, or were born into it, described her in words that did not agree on particulars but agreed on something essential. James Pope Hennessy, who spent years interviewing her circle for the official biography published in 1959 and kept private notes that were far more candid than anything in the authorized version, found in his interviews a consistent theme beneath the different vocabularies. A former member of her household told him directly, she put the throne above everything else, above every personal feeling, without exception and without negotiation. A former lady-in-waiting described her ability to freeze someone out entirely without ever doing anything explicit, without refusing an audience or sending a cold reply or delivering any statement that could be quoted as evidence of displeasure. She simply adjusted the quality of her attention downward, from the full presence that was her most characteristic mode to a polite and complete absence, gradually enough that the person being frozen could not locate the specific moment when the temperature had changed, only find themselves, some weeks later, clearly on the wrong side of something they could not name. The retired servants Pope Hennessy interviewed described their years in her service with a mixture of genuine loyalty and obvious relief. Loyal to the institution she represented, to the genuine seriousness of her commitment to it, to the quality of her attention when her attention was well disposed toward you. Relieved to be living at a remove from the center of that attention. Pope Hennessy himself noted the quality of stillness she carried. She could sit in a room and make everyone in it aware of her without speaking, without moving, without doing anything that could be identified as a bid for the room's notice. She occupied space differently from other people, with a concentrated presence that the room responded to, even when the room could not explain its own response. He found the experience memorable, and the experience difficult to describe, which is what memorable experiences tend to be. She told him, in a voice he recorded as entirely calm, that she would like to die to the sound of a military march. He wrote this down without comment. Some statements explain themselves fully enough without annotation, and the statement of a woman who had spent her adult life managing her own and her family's public self through the sustained application of discipline and form, choosing a military march as the appropriate accompaniment to her departure, is one of them. She lived to 85 years old. She outlived her husband, George V, who died in January 1936, and who was, in the plain human sense, the person she had been closest to, the person whose letters and whose company and whose equal commitment to the thing they were both committed to had constituted the fabric of her adult life. She outlived him by 17 years. She outlived her eldest son's reign. Edward III, known in the family as David, was king for 326 days before signing the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere on December 10, 1936, and going on the radio to tell his former subjects that he had found it impossible to perform the duties of king without the help and support of the woman he loved. The woman he loved was Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee whose second divorce was not yet final when the abdication happened. Queen Mary refused to meet Wallis Simpson. She refused the first time the opportunity arose, and she went on refusing for the remaining 15 years of her life. The refusal was not hot. It was not dramatic. It was simply final. She outlived the First World War and the Second World War. She outlived the anti-German feeling that had required her husband to change the family's name in 1917, an event she had substantially engineered by presenting George with the case for the change in terms he could receive, and continuing to present it until he was ready to act on it. She outlived her son George, the Duke of Kent, who died in a wartime aircraft crash in August 1942 at 39 years old. She outlived the empire that she had traveled to the center of in 1911, in a ceremony designed to make visible the thing it represented. She outlived most of the people who had understood her, and she outlived the context in which her particular gifts had been most legible. She died at Marlborough House on March 24, 1953, 10 weeks before her granddaughter Elizabeth was crowned at Westminster Abbey. She had wanted to be there. She had said so, with whatever force she permitted herself in private. She had organized her declining health, in the way she organized everything, around the date of June 2, 1953, as though the coronation were an appointment that could not be rescheduled, and her attendance at it were a matter of institutional commitment rather than personal desire. She was 85 years old, and her health had been in decline through the winter, but the coronation was the thing, and she intended to be present at it. She was not present at it. The 10-week gap is the final characteristic event of her life, and her life was full of characteristic events. She had arrived in the royal family as a young woman with limited resources and formidable preparation. She had watched the institution from the inside for decades, cataloguing its contents and shaping its decisions and managing its public presentation in ways that the public was not told about and the institution did not always acknowledge. She had buried children and managed abdications and organized wartime households and continued, through all of it, to be the thing she had decided to be at some point in her early life, the person who held the line, the person who did not bend when things required the line to hold. The 10 weeks between her death and the coronation are the final statement of a life that had been organized around the refusal to be present at the wrong time or in the wrong way. She had survived everything. She had not quite survived long enough. Elizabeth II stood on the pavement of London and watched her grandmother's funeral cortege pass. She was 26 years old. She had been watching her grandmother since the abdication crisis had first made the little girl's future crown visible, and she had been watching with the attentiveness that her grandmother modeled. Full presence, accurate assessment, no waste of attention on things that did not matter. She would carry the crown for 70 years. She is gone now. What May built, what Elizabeth continued, is still here. The royals feared her because she was immovable, and they could not find the gap in the armor. And when you cannot find the gap in armor, you stop looking for the person inside it and start responding to the armor itself. The armor was extraordinary. It had been built over many decades, beginning with a girl in a borrowed house in Richmond Park who had watched her mother spend money that did not exist, with the serene confidence of someone who had decided that other people's problem was not her problem, and who had decided, in response to that spectacle, that she herself was never going to be anyone else's problem. She spent 85 years making good on that decision. This is the full story of how she did it. We are going to take the time to tell it properly. She was also, and this matters for understanding everything else, almost immediately recognizable. By the time most people who cared about such things had formed a picture of her, she had become a figure whose visual signature was so consistent as to be almost heraldic. The hats. She wore hats of a particular kind, tall-crowned, broad-brimmed, ornamented in ways that dated from the Edwardian era, and were maintained past the point where fashion had moved on, because she had decided that the style suited the function, and she did not change things because other things had changed. She wore jewelry in quantities that would have overwhelmed a smaller person, and on her simply looked correct. The layers of pearls, the brooches at the shoulder, the choker that she had worn since before most of the people looking at her had been born. She carried a parasol, or an umbrella depending on the weather, and sometimes regardless of the weather. She was tall, and she held herself with the posture of someone who had been told from adolescence that posture was not optional, and had decided to agree. In old age, her posture remained. The back did not curve forward in the way that most people's backs eventually do. She remained vertical, in the specific way of someone who has maintained verticality so long that the body has simply forgotten how to do otherwise. People who saw her in person described the experience as different from seeing a photograph, in the way that substantial things are always different from their representations. She was not beautiful, had never been beautiful in the way that contemporary standards required beauty, but she was imposing, and imposing is a different category entirely. Imposing means the room adjusts itself around you when you enter it, not because you have made any demand, but because the room has responded to something you carry without announcing. She carried it at 85, exactly as she had carried it at 35. The physical presentation was deliberate in its every detail. She understood, in a way that some royals understand instinctively, and others have to be taught, and some never quite grasp, that the visible self of a monarch or a senior royal is a public communication, and that the communication needs to be accurate and consistent, and readable at a distance. You are not dressing for the people in the front row. You are dressing for the people at the back of the crowd, who need to be able to identify what they are looking at from 200 yards. The hats served this purpose. The height of them, the way they framed the face, and made the face visible at a distance, where a smaller hat would have made it disappear. She had opinions about everything she wore, and she expressed those opinions with the quiet firmness she brought to all her opinions. And the people who dressed her learned, quickly, that suggestions contrary to her formed preference were not rejected with displeasure, but were simply not adopted, which had the same practical outcome as rejection, but without the friction. The same principle extended to her residences. The rooms she occupied at Marlborough House were arranged to her satisfaction in the way that a museum, curated to a particular vision, is arranged. Everything in its proper position, nothing placed arbitrarily, the arrangement carrying an argument about what belonged near what, and why proximity mattered. Visitors sometimes noticed that the rooms felt more organized than rooms usually feel, more internally logical, and struggled to identify why. The why was that she had thought about where everything was, and had placed everything where she had decided it should be, and had not allowed it to drift from that position, because drift was the enemy of the argument the room was making. She was also, and this detail appears in multiple accounts from people who knew her, extremely difficult to surprise, not because she was incurious, but because she had developed a practice of preparation so thorough that situations rarely arose without her having considered them in advance. Before a meeting, she knew who she was meeting, what their position was, what their history with the crown was, and what the purpose of the meeting required her to achieve. Before a visit, she had been briefed on the household she was visiting, the family's history with the royal family, and what the occasion required by way of attention and response. Before a public engagement, she had been told who would be presented, and what they had done, and what would constitute appropriate acknowledgement. When you prepare at this level for everything, very little arrives as a surprise. What surprised her, in the limited cases where surprise was available, was human failure of a specific kind. The failure that came from choosing personal preference over institutional requirement. This she found genuinely incomprehensible, not because she lacked personal preferences, but because she had spent so long subordinating hers that she could no longer fully reconstruct the state of mind in which subordination felt like a choice, rather than simply the correct thing. Her eldest son's abdication surprised her in something like this way. She had known for years that Edward was not suited to be king in the way she understood kingship. She had watched him and worried in the specific way that she worried, privately and systematically, and without expressing the worry in any form that could have been received and acted on. She had watched the relationship with Wallace Simpson develop past the point of discretion into something she understood, long before the country understood, was going to require a resolution that would hurt the institution. But she had not quite believed, until it happened, that he would actually do it, that he would choose the thing he needed over the thing he was. She wrote a letter to him after the abdication. The letter was formal and warm in equal proportions, and he read the warmth as forgiveness, as the end of the rupture. He was wrong. The warmth was the warmth she had always extended to her children in the written form, the warmth that arrived in letters, in lieu of the warmth that did not arrive in rooms. The rupture continued for the rest of her life, because the abdication was not something she classified as a personal failing that could be forgiven. It was an institutional failing, and institutional failings were outside the category of forgivable acts. You did not forgive an institution for failing its function. You held the line and maintained the standard, and did not pretend the failure had not occurred. She held the line for 15 years, until she died. He outlived her by 19 years, and in those 19 years the line held. But all of that comes later in this story. We need to go back to the beginning, back before Marlborough House, and before the abdication, and before the cataloguing, and before the hats, and before the quality of stillness that made rooms adjust when she entered them. We need to go back to a house in Richmond Park, and a mother who could not stop spending money, and to understand what the girl who grew up in that house was building, year by year, as a response to everything that house contained. Because the armor had to be built out of something. The material it was built from was fear, and the fear had a specific origin. The quality of stillness she carried was described by virtually every person who spent sustained time near her, and the descriptions converge on the same observation. She could be seated in a room full of people, and make the room aware of her without speaking, without gesturing, without doing anything that could be named as a bid for attention. She occupied space with a concentrated presence that rooms responded to, without knowing why they were responding. Pope Hennessy, in the private notes he kept alongside his official biography research, recorded the experience of sitting with her for an interview and finding that the interview's shape was being determined entirely by where her attention went, rather than by his questions. He was the professional biographer, she was the subject. She made it clear without making it clear that this was her interview, and he was present at it. The notes described the experience as one of the most uncomfortable of his research career, not because she was rude or cold or obstructive, but because the quality of her attention was comprehensive and accurate, and it remained on you after it moved away, the way strong light stays in the eyes after you have looked from it. Her laugh was specific and not frequent. She found things funny that other people found merely informative, and what she found funny was often the gap between a situation's intended presentation and its actual character. She had spent enough time managing that gap herself, through the childhood years of the borrowed house and the maintained appearances, to find other people's management of the same gap amusing in ways she did not always share. The humor was dry and private. People who made her genuinely laugh were people who had perceived the gap between form and reality accurately, and named it, which was the thing she found genuinely worth laughing at. She was also considerably more self-aware than most accounts of her credit her with being. She knew she frightened people. She knew the household staff's behavior in the days before her visits was produced by what her visits had historically produced. She was not ignorant of the hiding of objects, not ignorant of the discomfort the social configuration she created placed the people in it. She held this knowledge, and she continued to produce the mechanism anyway, because the argument she was making about the institution's material history was an argument she believed in, and believing in it, she was not going to modify the mechanism simply because the mechanism was uncomfortable for the people inside it. She held the discomfort she created, and the rightness of the argument she was using the discomfort to advance simultaneously, which is the kind of moral complexity that people who are dismissed as cold are rarely credited with. The visual consistency was not vanity in the ordinary sense, it was argument. The tall crowned hats and the layers of pearls and the particular quality of erect posture were the communication, made through the medium of her person, that the institution was not diminished with time, did not accommodate itself to changing fashions, was not available for revision simply because the world around it was revising. The continuity of the appearance was the argument for the continuity of the thing the appearance represented. She told Pope Hennessy, in a voice he recorded as entirely calm, that she would like to die to the sound of a military march. He wrote this down without commentary. Commentary was not what the statement required. It required only the noting of it, because it was the clearest statement she had yet made about the relationship between the institution and her own death. She understood her death as an institutional event, an event that required the appropriate institutional form, and the appropriate institutional form for a person who had spent 60 years inside the machinery of the crown was a military march, rather than the private quiet that most people might have preferred for their ending. She had decided what she was a very long time ago. The armor was the decision made manifest, extended across 60 years of daily maintenance. Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge was born in 1833 and moved to Britain in 1837, the year the personal union between Britain and Hanover dissolved on the death of King William IV. She was a granddaughter of King George III, through his son the Duke of Cambridge, which placed her close enough to the centre of the royal family to carry weight in social configurations, and far enough from the succession to be managed by the family, rather than carefully cultivated by it. This distinction, the distinction between being important and being important enough to be the focus of serious institutional investment, is one that May absorbed early in her childhood because she absorbed everything that was demonstrated to her, and it was demonstrated constantly. Mary Adelaide was warm. This is the quality that every account of her identifies first, and it was genuine, not performed warmth, not the warmth of someone who has learned that warmth is useful, but the warmth of someone constitutionally inclined toward people, who finds other people genuinely interesting and entertaining and worth attention, who cannot pass a person who needs something without giving them something. She loved to entertain, loved large gatherings in which she was the center of social management, loved the theater and concerts, and the elaborate charity events she organized in drawing rooms that were too small for the ambitions she brought to them. She gave money away with the ease of someone who does not think about where money comes from, which was not an attitude she had earned through wealth, but one she had simply adopted as a mode of operation. She was also very large. The court nickname Fat Mary, used in letters and private gatherings among people who considered themselves her friends, had followed her since early adulthood. She was aware of the nickname. She was not made bitter or careful by it. She seems to have decided, at some point, that the warmth was the answer to the judgment, that if she gave enough of herself to enough people, the scale of the gift would eventually outweigh the verdict of the drawing room. This reasoning, if that is what it was not strategically unsound, and it worked for her socially in ways that her daughter found instructive without finding admirable. Mary Adelaide was 32 and still unmarried when Francis, Duke of Teck, was identified as a potential solution to the problem that a royal princess of marriageable age represents when she has not yet married. Francis was a German prince of impeccable manners and severe morganatic ancestry. His grandfather had married a woman outside the full ranks of European royalty, and the dynastic accounting system that governed these things had assigned the consequence forward in perpetuity: reduced titles, reduced rank, and above all reduced income. The morganatic ancestry did not quite disqualify him from consideration for Mary Adelaide's hand, because Mary Adelaide's own position in the order of things was not so elevated that the usual standards of equivalence applied with full strictness. He was handsome and personable and willing. She was 32 and had not found a more convenient candidate. They married in June of 1866 and established the household that would define May's entire childhood and early adulthood. The household operated from borrowed space. Kensington Palace apartments were made available by the Crown. White Lodge in Richmond Park was provided by Queen Victoria, who was generous in this specific way, while being considerably less generous in others. The houses were provided but not owned, occupied under conditions whose terms were never stated explicitly, but whose nature was entirely understood by May from the time she was old enough to understand such things. You do not own a house that has been made available to you. You live in it with a constant peripheral awareness that someone else's decision governs your presence in it. The feeling of borrowed ground. Against this backdrop of provided security, Mary Adelaide spent money that did not exist in quantities that the household's actual income could not support. Her parliamentary annuity was £5,000 a year, a sum that was substantial by the standards of most people and insufficient by the standards of a royal household that entertained at the scale she considered appropriate. The deficit accumulated. The management of the deficit, the management of creditors and conversations, and the maintenance of appearances that the social position required, was the background noise of May's entire childhood. Present always, never directly acknowledged, the gap between what the family presented and what the household actually contained, forming the permanent condition in which May learned to assess the world. She assessed it with unusual precision for a child. She watched her mother work drawing rooms the way a student of craft watches a master, noting the mechanics beneath the apparent ease, tracking which guests received the 10-minute conversation and which received the 30-minute version, and what determined the difference, observing how a potentially awkward social moment was redirected before it arrived, and how an invitation was extended with warmth that felt entirely spontaneous and was actually entirely calculated. Mary Adelaide was not calculating in the cynical sense. Her warmth was genuine, but warmth that produces consistent social effects has mechanics, even when the person deploying it is not consciously aware of them, and May was conscious of them. What she was building was a map of how social power actually worked, underneath the forms in which it was presented. The map was private. It did not need to be stated, because stating it would have changed its nature. You kept the map in your head, and you used it when the situation required using it. And in the meantime you continued to participate in the forms in which social power presented itself, as though the map did not exist. May also watched the things. Not in the warm, casual way that Mary Adelaide encountered things, accumulating them without system, because beautiful objects are beautiful, and why wouldn't you want them near you? May watched them the way she watched everything, with the question, what is this exactly, and where does it belong, and what does it tell you about the people who made it, and the people who have had it? She was developing the eye that would define the rest of her life. An eye not for beauty as an aesthetic absolute, but for the specific beauty of things that have been made with real skill to serve a real function, and have survived because the skill and the function were both genuine. She could identify fakes at an early age, not because she had been trained to, but because once you understood what the real thing looked like, the fake presented itself as slightly wrong in every detail. The debts eventually reached a level that the usual strategies could not absorb. In 1883, when May was 16 years old, the family left Britain for the continent. They travelled, diplomatically, under assumed names. The Count and Countess of Hohenstein, which was a title in Francis's family that provided cover for a few weeks before Mary Adelaide's requirements for appropriate treatment made the incognito impractical to maintain. They stayed with German relations in Württemberg, they moved through Austria, and they arrived eventually in Florence, where a relations villa provided accommodation, and where the question of what to do about the debts was negotiated through the correspondence that Mary Adelaide maintained with her creditors and her English advisers from the somewhat more comfortable distance of Tuscany. May was 16 when they arrived in Florence, and 18 when they left. And Florence in those 2 years was the most concentrated education she had received, or would receive. The city was organized around the evidence that things outlast the people who make them. The Medici who had commissioned the chapels and the palazzi, and the portraits, and the bronzes, were gone. The evidence of their intention remained, in better condition in many cases than the reputations of the men who had governed through fear, because the objects they commissioned had been cared for by institutions that had outlasted the institutions the Medicis had represented. The families that had governed Tuscany were names in guidebooks now. Their portraits hung in galleries that anyone with the admission fee could enter. What had survived was not the power. What had survived was the evidence of the power exercised on the things the power had commissioned. May walked through all of it. She went through churches and palaces and the halls of the Uffizi with the systematic attention she brought to everything, asking questions, examining details, building her own taxonomy of what she was seeing. She bought small things in the markets when her allowance permitted, and her allowance did not always permit, which meant she developed the discipline of the selective eye, the capacity to assess quickly what was worth the limited resource and what was not, to know when you were looking at the real thing, at an interesting price, and when you were being shown something that would not look the same in London light. In the markets she learned something additional. The relationship between what a thing had once commanded and what you could pay for it in the right circumstances was not fixed. Objects moved in the world according to the needs and ignorances of the people who held them. An object in the hands of someone who did not understand its value was available at a price that its value did not justify. The skill was in knowing the value more accurately than the person holding the object did, and in being willing to acquire based on the knowledge rather than the current price. This is not the same as deception. It is the advantage that knowledge gives you in a market where knowledge is unevenly distributed. May accumulated the knowledge with the patience of someone who understands that knowledge of this kind is a long-term investment. It would be decades before the investment fully returned. By then she had the resources to act on it at a scale that the markets of Florence could not have imagined. The family came back to England in 1885. The debts had been addressed, or at least reorganized, through the combination of reduced expenditure in Italy and negotiations handled by trustees who were better at this kind of thing than Mary Adelaide was. The family was poorer and somewhat more cautious and aware of the bottom of their social position in a way that 2 years of managed exile in a foreign city makes hard to avoid. May came home at 18 with a clearer picture of what she did not want her life to look like than most people of her age and class could construct, because most people of her age and class had not spent 2 years in a foreign city managing the consequences of a parental failure whose origins were perfectly legible to anyone paying attention. She applied herself to preparation, languages, primarily, because languages were among the things you could acquire through effort alone, without resources. French and German she spoke well, she added others more competently than fluently, but competence was sufficient for the purpose, and the purpose was to be able to move in any European setting without requiring the assistance that a language barrier would have necessitated. Music, because music was required, and because she had genuine feeling for it, though the genuine feeling was never her primary relationship with the piano. The social mechanics of presentation, how you entered a room, how you managed a conversation with someone you had never met, but whose position required a specific calibration of your response, how you handled the presentation ceremonies that the court required of young women making their official entry into that world. She was presented at court in 1886. Society assessed her with the careful attention it brought to every candidate who might end up somewhere in the upper reaches of the dynasty's social orbit. The assessment divided along the lines it usually divided. People who valued warmth found her cool. People who valued steadiness found her reassuring. She was not the kind of woman who walked into a room and elevated its temperature simply by arriving. She was the kind who sat down and made the room gradually understand that her assessment of it was more accurate than anyone else's, which is a different kind of presence entirely, less immediately comfortable, and considerably more lasting in its effect. Queen Victoria liked her, and Queen Victoria's preferences in such matters had a way of becoming the outcome in such matters. The Prince and Princess of Wales had other ideas about their eldest son's future, but the people paying the most careful attention tended, over the following years, to converge on May, and the convergence was driven by the thing that was most difficult to articulate in a social culture that prized the articulate, the quality of her seriousness. She was not performing seriousness. She was serious. About the role, about the institution, about the specific requirements of being the person inside it, rather than the person observing it from a comfortable distance. The seriousness had a source. The source was the borrowed house and the unpaid bills, and the 2 years in Florence, and the fundamental lesson that all of those experiences combined to teach, which was that charm is not sufficient protection against the consequences of charm without discipline. Her mother had demonstrated this daily for all of May's formative years, and May had watched it demonstrated, and had decided not to repeat it. She was looking, from very early on, for the position that would put the borrowed floor question behind her permanently. The position that was not provided but owned, not available but earned, not contingent on someone else's continued generosity, but built on something more structural, more permanent, more able to withstand the tests that the 20th century was preparing to apply. The position that answered these questions was Queen Consort of Great Britain and Ireland. She arrived at the threshold of that position in the winter of 1891, through a path that was neither clean nor comfortable, and walked through it with the composure she had been building for years. The specific texture of Florence in the 1880s was different from the Florence of the grand tourism of earlier decades. The English colony that had established itself in the city across the century was at that point large enough to constitute its own social world, with its own hierarchies and its own entertainments, and its own particular relationship to the city around it, which was a mixture of genuine engagement and the specific distance of people who have chosen to live somewhere because it provides things their home country does not, without fully inhabiting the cultural world they are choosing to live among. The Teck family moved within this colony, and also beyond it, through the introductions that Mary Adelaide's warmth generated, and that Francis's European connections made possible, and May watched both the English colony and the Italian world around it, with the observational appetite that was already her most characteristic quality. She was learning, in Florence, that there were multiple ways to be in a place. You could be in it as a visitor, experiencing it as an aesthetically organized provision for your pleasure, taking from it what it offered, and not requiring any deeper engagement. You could be in it as someone who had become a part of it, in the way that the English colony had become a part of Florence, present, socially embedded, but maintaining the specific Englishness that kept the cultural distance from the Italian life around them. Or you could be in it as the Florentines were in it, as people who had inherited a world and were responsible for maintaining it, and who engaged with it at the level of the inheritance rather than the visit. She could not be Florentine, obviously, but she could be in Florence the way the people were in it who took it most seriously, and she tried to be that kind of presence. The markets, the churches, the galleries, the hands-on examination of specific objects in specific conditions that let you see things that a guidebook description could not show you. The reading she did in the period was organized around what she was seeing, the history of the houses and the families and the commissions that had produced the objects she was looking at. And the reading and the looking fed each other in the way that the best kinds of study feed each other. She was also, in Florence, learning what she did not want. The English colony was a world of people who had chosen comfort over engagement, who had found a beautiful and inexpensive place to live, and had organized their lives around the beauty and the economy and the social life the colony provided, without making the deeper commitment to the place that the place was available for. This was not a failed life. It was a fully functional life that produced genuine pleasures. It was not the life she was going to have, and the clarity with which she understood this in Florence, watching her mother move through the colony with the warmth that was her mother's greatest gift, and that was also, May understood, what had brought the family to Florence in the first place, was the clarity that she brought home and carried forward. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, was known in the family as Eddie, and the most honest summary of what the historical record tells us about Eddie is that the historical record does not agree. He was the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, which positioned him second in the line of succession, and he had the physical appearance of his father's line, tall, fair, with the social ease of a man who had never needed to force his way into any room. He was also, in the judgment of most of the people who dealt with him in any official capacity, not suited to the position his birth had assigned him. His tutors had reported this with the diplomatic care that reporting such a thing to the parents of a heir required. His commanding officers had reported it with the somewhat franker directness available in a military context. His father, the Prince of Wales, who was not by nature an anxious man, and who was inclined to see the positive in his children's prospects, had worried about Eddie in ways that did not quite resolve into specific worries, because the problem with Eddie was not specific. There were other matters in the historical record that historians have argued over for more than a century without reaching anything like consensus. Stories of companions and establishments that the palace would have found devastating if made public. These stories have been examined so many times that the examination has become its own genre of historical inquiry, and this is not the place to adjudicate a case in which the primary evidence is long dead. What can be said with clarity is that the family wanted him settled, wanted him married to a suitable woman who would provide the stability that his character had so far failed to provide itself, and that by the autumn of 1891, the suitable woman who had emerged from the field of candidates was Princess May of Teck. Queen Victoria had been in favor of the match for some time. Victoria had the gift of identifying women who would be useful to the dynasty and placing them in positions where their usefulness could be exercised, and she had identified May several years before the engagement as a person who possessed the qualities the position required in quantities that the position required. The steadiness, the preparation, the willingness to subordinate personal preference to institutional demand, combined with the intelligence to understand what institutional demand required in any given situation. These were not the qualities that made a young woman glamorous in 1891. They were the qualities that made a young woman reliable, and in a royal family navigating the demands of a constitutional monarchy in a period of considerable social change, reliability was not a secondary quality. The engagement was announced in December 1891. It was received with satisfaction. The dynasty had found its next footing, or so it appeared to everyone who read the court announcements and the newspapers, and who had no particular reason to suspect what the following 6 weeks would bring. Prince Albert Victor contracted influenza in the epidemic that swept Britain in January 1892. The influenza developed into pneumonia. He died on January 14, 1892, at Sandringham, 28 years old. The announcement from the palace was brief and formal, as announcements of this kind were. The country was shocked, in the specific shock of a narrative that had seemed settled suddenly revealing itself as fragile. May was left in a position for which the court had no established protocol. She was not a widow, because she had not yet become a wife. She was not a jilted fiancée, because no one was at fault for what had happened. She was a young woman who had been publicly chosen by the dynasty and had publicly lost the person who had chosen her, and who now occupied a social position that had no name and no script. She withdrew, as was appropriate. She grieved, as best she could grieve for someone she had known for a short time and had not yet had the opportunity to fully know. And she remained in the orbit of the royal family, because Queen Victoria, who had invested genuine thought in this match, and who was not a woman who released useful people when they had demonstrated their usefulness, kept her close. George, the surviving son, was 25. He was Prince of Wales now in everything but formal title, which would come in the expected sequence. He was a different order of person from his brother, direct where Eddie had been vague, interested in concrete things where Eddie had been interested in pleasure, serious about the responsibilities of his position, in ways that his father found somewhat puzzling, because his father was by nature more interested in the pleasures than the responsibilities. George had served in the Navy and had absorbed the Navy's ethic. Competence was the thing, and competence meant doing your job accurately and on time, and not making excuses for the occasions when you had not. He was not in any obvious way emotionally sophisticated. His emotional vocabulary was limited to a few reliable registers, and he expressed himself most freely in letters rather than in person, because the letter allowed him the time to construct what he wanted to say without the real-time pressure of the room. He was fond of jokes of a kind that required a certain tolerance to find funny. He was a devoted stamp collector and a serious shot, and a man who, when he loved his children, showed it primarily in the form of concern about whether they were doing the right things in the right ways, which is not the form that most children can receive as love. May and George grew toward each other through the year following Eddie's death, in the particular slow way of two people who find themselves occupying adjacent positions in a mourning family, and who are assessed by that family as having qualities that complement each other's deficiencies. Their correspondence from this period shows a mutual regard that is genuine without being especially demonstrative. She wrote to him about what she was reading, about the houses she was visiting, about the small events of a life conducted at a careful remove from anything that might look like an appeal for his attention. He wrote back with the directness that was his characteristic mode, asking questions that she answered and offering information about his own circumstances that he would not have offered to someone whose interest he did not value. By May 1893, George had proposed. The proposal was in a garden in Richmond Park, which is either an accident of geography or a small irony. The girl who had grown up in the borrowed house in Richmond Park, receiving from the heir to the throne the offer that would settle the borrowed floor question permanently. She accepted. The engagement was announced and received, with the relief that communities feel when a disrupted narrative is restored. The rightness of the outcome, covering the slight unease that the path to it produced in people who thought about it for too long. The wedding took place on July 6, 1893, at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. London produced the crowds that London produced for royal occasions of this kind, large, genuinely warm, interested in the spectacle, and satisfied by the couple they were watching. The photographs from the day show two people who look correct and composed, because correct and composed was how both of them confronted a camera, and the combination was not performance. It was their actual mode of operating in formal situations, and their actual modes turned out to match. The early years of the marriage produced something that surprised some observers, and need not have surprised anyone who had studied what each of them was. A genuine partnership, built on complementary strengths rather than on romance in the conventional sense, and sustained by a shared commitment to the thing they were both committed to. George valued the monarchy as an institution in the plain, non-intellectual way of someone for whom it was the air he breathed. May valued it in the more analytic way of someone who had chosen it, who had examined it as a system and decided that the system was worth sustaining, which is a different and arguably more durable form of commitment. They were also different in ways their private letters make clear over the decades. George expressed feeling with sudden directness when the feeling broke through the surface, and afterward returned to his normal mode, as though nothing had happened. May expressed very little directly. Her letters to George are warm, detailed, reliable, and revealing in the way that texts by extremely intelligent and disciplined people reveal themselves, through the choices they make, through what is present and what is absent, through the gap between what a person says and what a person who knows them well understands them to mean. George sometimes asked her, in letters, what she was actually thinking. He asked not because he doubted her affection, but because the access to her internal experience was never simply available. You had to ask for it, and asking did not guarantee that what you received was the full answer. She could not easily give him the full answer because she had spent years building a wall between her interior experience and the exterior she presented to the world, and walls of that quality do not have doors that open conveniently from the outside. She did not intend the wall as a barrier between them. It had been built as protection against conditions that no longer applied, and she had been building it for so long that dismantling it, in even the particular situation of a marriage in which she trusted the person on the other side, was not something she knew how to do. George loved her. This is clear from the correspondence and from the accounts of people who knew them both. He loved her in the straightforward, practical way that was his mode of loving things. He relied on her. He valued her judgment. He found her presence organizing in a way that his life without her presence was less organized. When she was at a distance, he wrote to her more frequently than the protocols of royal travel required, and the letters were longer than they needed to be, and longer means something in a man whose natural mode was brevity. She loved him. This is also clear, though it appears in the record in different ways, in the care she took with his correspondence, in the specific detail with which she described things she had seen on visits to places he had not accompanied her, as though she were making sure he could see what she had seen. In the letters she wrote to him during the 4 years after his death, when she was already failing and had entered the kind of old age in which you feel more clearly than you have been able to feel for decades, the feeling breaking through the worn-down wall like water through cracked stone. She could not say it simply. She had not been able to say it simply at 30. She was not going to develop the capacity at 78 or 80, but it was there. The year between the fiancé's death and the next proposal was not a year May described for anyone with directness, because the emotional experience of it was not something she had developed adequate language for, and because developing that language had not been the priority of her formation. She had lost a future, which is the specific loss that is hardest to place in the categories of loss that have names. Because what you have lost is not something that was yet yours, but something that was going to be yours. The going to be quality makes the loss genuinely ambiguous from the outside. People grieved Eddie, whom they had known. People were not quite sure how to hold May's loss, which was of a position and a future she had barely begun. She managed it with the exterior maintained and the interior unshared. She continued to appear at the events the social calendar required. She continued the correspondence her position required keeping. She walked. She read. She visited. George had been present throughout the engagement. The management was visible in the precision of the exterior, and the precision communicated that the interior was being managed, without communicating what the managing was costing. George had been present throughout the engagement and throughout the year of mourning, in the adjacent way of a second son who is always near the main event without being its protagonist. He had written to May during the engagement with the letters that a prospective brother-in-law writes, warm and interested, and not overstepping. After Eddie's death, the register did not change immediately. What changed, over months, was the frequency and the quality of attention, the specific weight that accumulates when two people pay attention to each other with a purpose neither has yet named. George was not indirect in any aspect of his character. When he was ready to act on what the correspondence had built toward, he acted directly. The proposal in a garden in May 1893 was direct and was accepted immediately, which people who have misread May as a cold calculator find puzzling. She was not cold. She was organized, which is a different thing entirely, and she had been paying attention to George for a year with the same thoroughness she brought to everything she attended to, and what she had found was a person she believed she could build a life with. The acceptance was immediate because she was already certain. Their partnership had, from the early years, the quality that the best partnerships have, not the romantic fiction of two people who complete each other, but the more durable reality of two people whose respective limitations and strengths are organized around each other's, in ways that make both more effective than they are separately. George was direct and decisive, and could not communicate what he felt about abstract or personal things without considerable difficulty. May was patient and strategic, and could not communicate what she felt about personal things without the management process that distance provided. Together they made decisions better than either made them alone, because his directness gave her patience somewhere to land, and her patience gave his directness something to learn from over time. He wrote to her constantly when they were apart. The letters were longer and more personal than correspondence conducted as epistolary duty, the letters of a man who genuinely missed the person he was writing to, and found that the missing produced things worth sending. She wrote back with the specific detail she gave to the people whose attention she valued, detail about places she had seen and things she had visited, and small events in the household management that would interest him specifically, because she knew what specifically interested him. She loved him. This is clear in the record, and sometimes obscured by accounts that focus on the formal character of the marriage, and miss the genuine substance beneath the form. The love was real. The love was also managed in the way she managed everything, held in the register of the possible, rather than the register of the freely given, and reliable and lasting was what the institution needed, and what George needed too. York Cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk was the house George had been given after his marriage, and George loved it with the specific intensity that people who find their right place early sometimes love that place for the rest of their lives. It was not a large house. It had been built to accommodate overflow guests from the main Sandringham house during large shooting parties, which meant that it was adequate for a small household of people who intended to stay briefly, and inadequate, by any reasonable measure, for a family that was going to grow into 6 children and the staff required to maintain a royal household of that size. The rooms were narrow. The passages were dark. The house had the character of a house built for temporary occupation by people who would find their main comforts elsewhere, and it was maintained by George in roughly the condition in which he had received it, comfortable by his standards, which were the standards of a man who had spent years in naval quarters, and crowded by any other measure. May did not love York Cottage. Her feelings about it were more complicated than that, and less clearly stated, because she did not clearly state feelings of that kind. But the record contains enough evidence of her complicated relationship with the house to make the point. She found it cramped. She found Sandringham in winter, which was when they were most often there, cold in the way that Norfolk is cold, when the wind comes off the North Sea in January, and the trees have shed everything they had, and the landscape has the pared-down quality of a place that does not pretend to be comfortable for any living thing that has not adapted to it specifically. She managed it all with the composure she managed everything, making the rooms she occupied as organized and considered as the rooms allowed, finding within the constraints whatever space existed for the pursuit of what mattered to her, and not expressing her preferences in the form of complaint. George was happy there. This counted for something. They had 6 children in 11 years, which was not unusual by the standards of their time and class, and was a great deal of children by any personal measure. Edward in June 1894, named Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, known in the family as David, because the palace always maintained the gap between the public title and the private person, and David was the last of his names and the one they used. Albert in December 1895, named Albert Frederick Arthur George, known in the family as Bertie. Mary in April 1897, the only daughter. Henry in March 1900, who became the Duke of Gloucester. George in December 1902, who became the Duke of Kent. John in July 1905, the youngest by 3 years, who would not live to see his 14th birthday. 6 children in a house that had been designed for temporary guests, with the additional pressure of a royal household's requirement for staff and ceremony, and the public visibility that meant the children were being assessed from the moment of their births by people who had decided what they ought to be and were watching to see whether they would become it. George was an engaged father in the ways available to him. He was interested in what his children were doing. He checked on their progress. He involved himself in the management of their education and their behavior with a directness that was characteristic of everything he did. He was also a man whose emotional vocabulary was limited to a few reliable modes, and whose way of expressing concern was sometimes indistinguishable, from the recipient's perspective, from expressing disapproval. When he worried about a child, he said so plainly. When a child's behavior did not meet his standard, he said that plainly too. He did not soften these statements with the warmth that might have made them easier to receive, because softening was not in his natural vocabulary, and because his own father had not softened them for him, and he had turned out satisfactorily. May was present in the household in the comprehensive organizational sense. Everything was arranged, everything ran on time, the children's requirements were managed, and their education was overseen, and the household's complex machinery was maintained at a consistent standard. She was also absent in the sense that mattered most to young children, which is the sense of physical and emotional availability. She did not sit with them in the unself-conscious way that some mothers sit with their children, not doing anything in particular, just being near. She was near them in purposeful ways, supervising, teaching, managing. The nearness had a character. Children who grow up with purposeful nearness learn that their parents' presence is a conditional state, available when there is a reason for it to be available, and withdrawn when the day's program does not include them. Both George and May had been raised in versions of this model. George's father was warm and charismatic, and enormously good fun, in ways that did not intersect reliably with his son's emotional needs. His mother was beautiful and devoted, and organized her warmth around the social requirements of the position, rather than the emotional requirements of the children. Neither of them had been held simply, without purpose, in the way that children most need to be held, and neither of them had developed the capacity for this kind of holding. They transmitted the model they had received, faithfully and without cruelty, to 6 children who would each respond to it in their own way, and the responses would take decades to become fully legible. The household at York Cottage had a rhythm that May established and maintained, with the consistency she brought to everything she maintained. Mornings began at a specific time. Lessons ran according to a fixed schedule, with the appropriate tutors for the appropriate subjects, arriving at the appropriate hours. Meals were at set times and were conducted with the formal attentiveness that May considered non-negotiable in any gathering at which the children were present, because meals were the daily practice of behavior in a social setting, and the practice mattered. Evenings had their own structure. Sundays were different from weekdays. Bank holidays were different from Sundays. The structure was not arbitrary. It was the visible form of the argument May was making about how life should be lived, with deliberation, with order, with the understanding that the things you do regularly and consistently are the things that define what you are. She took the children to museums when the opportunity arose. She took them to churches, not primarily for devotion, but because churches were full of things that told you about the history of the places they were in, and knowing the history of the places you inhabited was a way of being located in something larger than your own immediate circumstances. She discussed what they were seeing with them in terms that her own childhood education had given her, the vocabulary for visual and historical analysis that the Florence years had developed, and she expected a level of attention from them that some of them found natural and others found difficult to sustain. What she was trying to build in them was what she had built in herself, what she regarded as the indispensable equipment for the lives they were going to lead. The ability to inhabit a public role with the full attention that the role required, without allowing personal feeling to interfere with the performance of the role's functions. This was not an easy thing to teach, and it was especially not easy to teach to children who were also being asked to produce the personal feeling that was the private cost of the public role. She knew the difficulty. She had lived the difficulty herself. She had resolved it, in the way that she had resolved it, and she was trying to transmit the resolution to children who were going to need it. What she could not transmit was the access to the private self that the resolution had cost. The capacity to show her children that she felt things, felt them deeply, felt them in ways that were not always manageable or dignified. The things that most parents give their children without knowing it, simply by being human in their presence. She had spent too long managing that capacity to offer it freely. The result was that the children received the form of the commitment without the warmth that makes the form bearable. They received the careful management without the spontaneous presence. They received the mother who was there for every purpose except the purposes that most needed her, and they each found their own way of living inside that absence, and their ways were all different. George adored his wife. He wrote to her when he traveled with a regularity and a length that exceeded necessity, because the letters were his way of maintaining the connection that the physical distance interrupted. He depended on her judgment in the way that men who are honest with themselves about their limitations depend on someone else's strengths, completely, without resentment, with genuine gratitude that the strengths are there. He was not easy to live with. He was blunt and somewhat inflexible in his domestic habits, and inclined to assume that his preferences were the natural preferences for the household, rather than one set of preferences among several possible sets. He did not change easily. He did not adapt readily to other people's comfort when his own comfort was available. May accommodated all of this with the patience that accommodation requires when it is not resentment wearing the mask of patience but actual accommodation, the choice made daily to manage the person as they are, rather than as you might prefer them to be. They were, in the plain terms that matter most, good for each other. They produced, together, something that neither of them could have produced alone. A stable center for an institution that was going to need a stable center very badly in the coming decades. May organized the available space with the systematic attention she brought to any situation containing organizational deficiencies. The rooms she used were arranged to function within their actual dimensions rather than to pretend they were larger. Everything had a reason for its position. The writing desk was positioned for the best light. The reference volumes were within reach of the desk in the order that using them required. The small collection of objects she was assembling was placed with the argument about what belonged near what she had been developing since Florence. She was educating herself, through the York Cottage years, for the institutional project she intended to undertake. She corresponded with dealers who specialized in the periods and styles most represented in the royal collection. She corresponded with scholars whose expertise in specific areas exceeded her own, and she acknowledged the excess without defensiveness, because accuracy mattered more to her than the appearance of omniscience. She read systematic histories of the royal collection and the royal residences, not as general interest, but as targeted preparation. She was building the expertise that would eventually allow her to assess the collection's gaps and inaccuracies and organizational deficiencies with the authority of someone who actually knew what was there and what wasn't, and what the difference meant to the institutional argument the collection could make. She was doing all of this while managing a household of 8, in a house designed for weekend guests, in Norfolk winters she did not love, while performing every social and domestic obligation the position required. The compression of the York Cottage years is one of the things that most clearly demonstrates who she was. The full scale of intellectual ambition and institutional purpose, conducted in circumstances that had nothing to do with the scale of the ambition. She was preparing to manage a royal collection in rooms designed for temporary occupation. She was building the expertise of a curator in the house of a borrowed estate. She did not let the rooms determine the preparation. George loved Sandringham in the specific way of a man who has found the place where he is most purely himself, and York Cottage was where he was at Sandringham, which made it, in his understanding, exactly right. He shot the estate. He walked every field and hedgerow with the accumulated knowledge of decades of walking it. He managed the stamps with the passionate precision that serious philately requires. He maintained his diary. He presided over meals with a slightly demanding attention to whether things were as they should be. He was happy there, and he said so. And May noted his happiness with the appreciation of someone who values happiness in the people she loves, even when the location of the happiness is not her preferred location. Her private experience of Sandringham in the winter, which was when the family was most regularly there, was one of the more consistently unspoken facts of her inner life. Norfolk in January is cold in the way that flat coastal land is cold. The wind off the North Sea without any hill or building to deflect it. The fields bare. The sky low and grey, with a persistence that people who love the landscape accept, and people who do not find punishing. She managed it with the acceptance. She managed all things she could not change, and she organized within it everything that could be organized, and the organizing was sufficient. The 6 children of George V and Queen Mary deserve individual attention because the family as a whole is often discussed in terms of its collective dysfunction without sufficient attention to the ways in which each of the 6 responded differently to the same conditions. The conditions were specific and consistently maintained, and the different responses to them tell you as much about the conditions as about the children who were subjected to them. Edward, who was called David, was the eldest, and in the way of eldest children in large families, he carried the specific weight of being the first attempt the parents made at the project of child-raising. He was blonde, charming, and possessed from an early age of a quality that adults found irresistible and that was genuinely real rather than performed. The ability to make any person he was talking to feel that they were the most interesting person in the room and that he was glad they were there. He was not doing this cynically. He found people genuinely engaging, found the variety of human experience and personality genuinely interesting, and his attention landed on people with a warmth that they experienced as personal, even when the warmth was essentially structural, a feature of his character rather than a specific response to theirs. His father admired this quality and distrusted it in roughly equal measure. George V was a man who believed that substance was what mattered, and that the appearance of substance without the underlying substance was at best useless and at worst dangerous. And David's charm had the quality of substance without necessarily having the underlying substance. George could not always tell whether his eldest son was actually paying attention or performing paying attention, and this uncertainty made him uncomfortable in the specific way that things he could not fully assess made him uncomfortable. He corrected David. He criticized David's focus, David's persistence, David's tendency to use his social gifts as a way of managing situations rather than engaging with their actual requirements. He said these things plainly, because plain was his mode, and he said them in circumstances where the saying was observed by David's siblings and his household and his tutors. David heard it all. He processed the message differently from how George intended it. George intended, sharpen up, apply yourself. The charm is not enough. David received, the thing I do naturally is wrong. The person I am naturally is insufficient. The gap between the intended message and the received message was not anyone's fault. It was the gap that opens when a parent's criticism, however accurate, is not cushioned by enough unconditional warmth to make the criticism feel like help rather than judgment. When children feel judged rather than helped, they do not typically respond by becoming more disciplined. They typically respond by looking for validation from sources that are less demanding. David spent the rest of his life looking for validation from sources that were less demanding. He found it, reliably, in women. Women who were warm with him in ways that had nothing to do with whether he was performing his institutional role adequately. Women who wanted him specifically, not the Prince of Wales or the King of England, but David, the person who existed before and beneath the titles. He attached to these women with a completeness that alarmed everyone who could see what he was attaching to and why. And the alarm was not wrong. The completeness of the attachment described the size of the need it was trying to fill. His relationship with his mother was real and warm in the epistolary sense. Their letters are full of genuine affection, full of the specific quality of attention that May gave through the written word to everyone she cared about. What the letters cannot show is the physical presence that most children need alongside the written word, the spontaneous warmth that arrives without being requested, the look that says, I see you, and I am glad you exist regardless of what you are currently doing or failing to do. The letters were there. The look was not quite there, not reliably, not in the form that children can receive it. David grew up understanding that the love was available in certain forms and not in others, and he spent his adult life trying to find the form that felt most like what he had needed and not quite received. Albert, the second son, was called Bertie, and where David had cornered the market in charm, Bertie developed effort as his primary mode. He worked harder than David at everything, not because he was more capable, but because he believed more urgently that the gap between where he was and where he needed to be could be closed through effort, if the effort was sustained. He had a stammer that appeared in early childhood and that became more pronounced under the pressure of situations that required him to speak formally, which meant that the situations most likely to require his articulate public self were precisely the situations in which his articulate public self was least available to him. His father's response to the stammer was the response of a man who dealt with problems by confronting them directly. He corrected Bertie when he stumbled, completed sentences for him when the stammer made completion take too long, insisted that the thing be faced and managed rather than allowed to develop unchallenged. The theory behind this approach was not cruel. The practice of it was damaging in ways that a more emotionally sophisticated parent might have anticipated. Every public correction confirmed, from the receiving end, that the stammer was a visible failure in a family where visible failure was not easily tolerated. Every completed sentence communicated, what you are producing is not adequate and someone else needs to correct it. Bertie's relationship to his own voice became a source of constant anxiety, the mouth that did not work as required, the instrument of the self that failed publicly in the family that most required public competence. He did not fail. That is the remarkable thing about Albert. he did not give in to the anxiety and retreat from the public requirements of his position. He went on performing them, went on speaking in public, went on bearing the stammer and the awareness of being watched with the stuttered word visible to everyone in the room, and went on doing this year after year through a childhood and an adolescence and an early adulthood that offered him no particular reason to believe the situation would improve. The improvement came late and through an unlikely route. In 1926, when Bertie was 30 years old and had been Duke of York for several years, a friend introduced him to Lionel Logue, an Australian speech therapist working in London, whose approach to stammering was different from anything Bertie had encountered in the years of previous treatment. Logue worked with breathing, with the physical relationship between the body and the voice, with the anxiety that was not the cause of the stammer, but was its constant companion and amplifier. The work required sustained effort from Bertie over months and years, but the stammer improved, steadily, enough to make the difference between a man who could not speak in public and a man who could. Bertie would stammer for the rest of his life, under sufficient pressure, but the stammer no longer owned the situation. May watched Albert's struggles with the specific anguish of a mother who sees her child suffering from something she cannot fix, and whose means of responding to this watching are limited by her own emotional architecture. She wrote to him with warmth and encouragement, the warmth more freely available through the written form than in person. She found ways to indicate, in the particular indirect style that was her mode, that she was aware of his difficulties, and that her opinion of him was not diminished by them. She did not challenge George's management of the situation publicly. Whether she found other ways to influence it is not fully clear from the record. Mary, the Princess Royal, was the only daughter, and the position of the only daughter in a family of 6 children where the inheritance goes to sons is a position that requires a particular kind of adaptation. Mary was practically intelligent, organizationally competent, steady in the way that steadiness looks like its own distinct gift when it is consistently demonstrated, and largely invisible in the family narrative, because the family narrative was organized around the sons, their crises and achievements and failures, and daughters were expected to conduct their lives in a manner that did not generate crises or significant failures, and to receive correspondingly less narrative attention. She was the child most like her mother in temperament, in the specific combination of practical intelligence and emotional management, and her mother valued this without quite knowing how to acknowledge it, because acknowledging it would have required the kind of explicit statement about what she valued in a person that May did not easily make. Mary married the Earl of Harewood in 1922 and conducted herself with such consistent competence through the next 5 decades that the history of the royal family in the 20th century can pass through long stretches without requiring her direct presence, which is one of the highest compliments available to a royal woman who values doing her job properly over being seen doing it. Henry, who became the Duke of Gloucester, made a choice that is underappreciated in the family chronicle. He decided to be unremarkable. This sounds like failure, and was in fact a sophisticated response to the conditions of his upbringing. He was the 4th of 5 surviving children, with 2 older brothers who generated considerable narrative heat, and a father who communicated dissatisfaction through direct and regular statement. Henry saw what happened to people in this family when they made themselves visible in ways that did not meet the standard, and he made himself less visible. He carried out his official duties, he made a suitable marriage. He was present when presence was required, and absent when absence was possible, and he generated very little in the way of drama throughout a long life that outlasted most of his siblings. He died in 1974 at 74, the last of the 6 children to die, and the obituaries noted his service and his loyalty and his remarkable unremarkableness, which was in the specific context of his family the most remarkable thing about him. Prince George, who became the Duke of Kent, was beautiful and brilliant and reckless in ways that the other children were not. He had the looks of the maternal line in a more concentrated form than his siblings, and he had a quality of presence that stopped people in rooms the way David's presence stopped them, but differently. David's was the warmth of personal attention. George's was the brightness of someone who was fully lit from within and could not quite be turned down. He was intelligent in ways that showed, curious about art and music and architecture and the people who made things worth making, and he was also, in ways that the family managed with varying degrees of success and alarm, reckless in his private life, with a comprehensiveness that the palace found genuinely frightening in the early years of his adulthood. The records of his 20s, the parts that are now accessible, describe companions and habits that the palace understood as potential catastrophes and that required management over several years. He was not discreet. Discretion was not something he seemed to find natural. The brightness that made him compelling also made concealment difficult for him, and the things he did not conceal were not things the family could afford to have made public. The management was successful, mostly. He married Princess Marina of Greece in 1934, in what was, by the accounts of people who knew them both, a genuine love match of the kind the royal family did not always produce. He was 31, and she was beautiful and self-possessed, and brought to the marriage a style and an intelligence that the court had not quite seen in that combination before. He died at 39. On August 25, 1942, during the Second World War, the RAF Sunderland flying boat in which he was travelling from Scotland to Iceland crashed in Caithness shortly after takeoff. There were 15 people on board. One survived. George was not the one. He was killed in an instant that the war generated without particular awareness that it was generating it. One of the several 100,000 deaths that the war produced in that period by the sheer momentum of the machinery it had set in motion. His mother received the news with the composure that she had maintained through every previous difficulty. She wrote the necessary letters. She appeared at the necessary events. She did not cancel. She did not break down in any visible form. She continued to move forward at the pace that was her natural pace, and that was also, she had long since decided, the only response to loss that the institution she served could permit. What she felt is in the record, only in the restraint of the record itself, in the places where the letters say less than they say in other letters, in the gaps that appear where in previous bereavements the letters had been fuller. She had lost a son, the brilliant, reckless son she had worried about, and managed and loved in the particular constrained way that she loved everything. And the loss was inside the wall, and it stayed inside the wall, and the wall held. And then there was John. He was born in July 1905, 3 years after Prince George, the last of the 6 children, and the accounts of his early childhood describe a child who was direct and lively, and engaged with the world in the specific way of children who have not yet learned the social management skills their family and class expect of them. He had epilepsy. The seizures appeared in childhood and worsened over the following years in severity and frequency, and the treatment available in that era for a condition of that kind was limited and largely inadequate. He also had, in the assessment of medical historians who have examined the available evidence with the diagnostic vocabulary of the present, rather than the era, characteristics strongly associated with autism spectrum conditions, a directness that ignored the protocols his family regarded as essential, an engagement with the world that followed its own logic, rather than the logic of the social system around him, an absence of the management skill that the palace considered not optional, but structural to the functioning of a royal household and a royal public life. In 1916, when John was 11 years old, a decision was made. He was moved from the main royal household to Wood Farm, a smaller property on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, where a small permanent household was established around him. His nurse, Lalla Bill, to whom he was deeply attached, and who was devoted to him, moved with him. He was not moved to an institution. He was moved to a house on the family's own estate, with his own staff and his own routine, and the company of local children from the estate, with whom he formed friendships that the more socially supervised world of the main household could not have accommodated. He was not sent away in deliberate cruelty. The era did not have the conceptual vocabulary to assess his needs in the way we would now assess them. The palace could not accommodate the public visibility of a prince who could not perform the social protocols that public visibility required. These were real constraints of a real kind, and the family operated within them with the tools available to them, and the tools did not include what we would now understand as appropriate accommodation or appropriate inclusion. He died in January 1919, at 13 years old, following a severe seizure. The world had spent the last 4 years in a war that had killed 10 million people, and Britain was in the early days of the influenza pandemic that would kill somewhere between 50 and 100 million more. John's death arrived in a context already full of death, which did not make it a smaller death, but made the space available for acknowledging it publicly much smaller. May wrote to a close friend shortly after his death that it was, she felt, the greatest relief. The sentence has been extracted from its context and used for more than a century as the clearest evidence of her emotional deficiency, cited in biographies and documentaries and think pieces as the proof of what was wrong with her as a mother. Read in context and read with knowledge of what the seizures had been like in the years before his death, and read with the understanding that relief, in the vocabulary of grief, almost always means I could not bear to watch him suffer any longer, and I am glad he is no longer suffering. The sentence is recognizable as the thing almost every parent who has watched a child suffer a long, unmanageable, progressive condition thinks when the suffering ends. May said it plainly because she did not have the capacity for the kind of public emotional performance that would have made the sentence look more like what it was. She was not the mother most of her children needed. She was not capable of being that mother, because the thing most of her children needed was the thing she had spent the most effort protecting against, the full exposure of the self that feeling requires. She had protected against it in the way she had protected against it, and could not undo the protection in the specific situations where it most needed to be undone. But the protection was not absence. She was present. She cared, in the way she cared about everything she committed herself to, which was with her full attention. The gap between her full attention and the warmth that accompanies full attention in people who have not built the wall she built was the gap that her children lived in, and it was not a comfortable gap. It was, however, the gap that produced some of the more extraordinary responses available to human beings in difficult conditions. Albert became king. The Mary became a model of reliable competence. Henry chose sanity. George found beauty and love before the war took him. John found Lalla Bill and the fields of Sandringham and a few years of a life that the palace could not accommodate, but that the human world, outside the palace's requirements, contained and supported. David lost his throne. That comes later. The specific ways in which the children responded to the conditions of their upbringing are, in the long run, the most complex part of May's story, because the responses were so various that they resist the single explanatory narrative that biographers and documentary makers have often tried to apply to them. The narrative that the royal family was emotionally damaged by May's coldness is partly true, and partly a simplification that misses the ways in which each of the 6 children found something usable in the same conditions that also cost them something. What is certain is that the transmission occurred. The model of institutional commitment over personal feeling, of exterior management over interior display, of the position's requirements as the governing principle against which personal preference was measured, that model was transmitted through the sustained daily demonstration of a mother who lived by it completely. The transmission was not even across the 6 children. Some of them received it and used it as their primary mode. Some received it and rejected it as their primary mode, which produced its own costs. Some received it in modified form and built lives that combined elements of it with the warmer material they found from other sources, but none of them was unaffected by it. The model was too present, too consistent, too completely embodied by the person living it to leave no mark on the people who were watching it daily from childhood onward. The mark it left on Elizabeth II is the most historically consequential of all the marks it left, and it is the most legible, because Elizabeth's 70-year reign provides enough evidence to see the transmission clearly, the steadiness that did not depend on the audience's approval, the standard applied to the position's requirements without accommodation for personal preference, the willingness to continue performing the functions of the position in conditions where many people would have considered the continuation sufficient grounds for discontinuation, the management of the interior that did not display, that produced the appearance of unknowability in a person who was entirely present and entirely attentive to the people around her. These were not Elizabeth's natural characteristics, any more than they were May's natural characteristics. They were the result of the sustained demonstration that Elizabeth had been watching since before she had the conceptual framework to understand what she was watching. May had taught Elizabeth by being May. That is the specific form the instruction took, and it is the form that the deepest instruction always takes. Not the thing that is said, but the thing that is done, consistently, over the period of time it takes for the watching to become understanding, and the understanding to become practice. George V became king on May 6, 1910, after the death of Edward VII, and May became queen consort, and the weight of the position they moved into was considerably greater than the weight of the position they had left. Not in the personal sense, because they had both been preparing for this moment for years, and in some respects the preparation had been more demanding than the arrival. In the institutional sense, the palace, the ceremonies, the correspondence, the audiences, the obligations of public visibility at every moment, the requirement to represent the crown continuously and without apparent fatigue, in settings that ranged from state banquets to hospital wards, to factory openings, to foreign state visits, all of it now belonged to them permanently and fully. May had been studying for this role for 3 decades. She moved into Buckingham Palace as queen consort and proceeded to do something that no previous occupant had done with quite the same deliberate, systematic attention. She began to document what was there. The palace's contents were, by any reasonable assessment, a problem waiting to be solved. Centuries of monarchy had accumulated in its rooms without the systematic documentation that would have made the accumulation legible. Objects of genuine historical significance sat alongside objects of personal sentiment, alongside objects that had arrived without records and been left without records, because no one had prioritized the record-keeping. Royal commissions from the 16th century and acquisitions from the 20th existed in the same rooms without any visible hierarchy of importance. The history of how things had entered the collection, which monarch had received them, and from whom, and on what occasion, and for what reason, had become partial in many cases and entirely lost in others. May believed, as she had believed since Florence, that an institution that could not account for its own material past was an institution operating with a significant handicap. The argument for the monarchy's continuity was in part an argument made through objects, through the accumulated material evidence of its presence in British life across many centuries, and the argument could only be made effectively if the objects and their histories were understood. She began the work of documentation, building a catalogue of the royal collection that would be the most sustained project of her long adult life. She worked at it with the systematic attention she brought to everything. She engaged experts. She consulted dealers whose knowledge of the periods and styles represented in the collection was deeper than her own. She verified attributions that had been accepted without verification. She restored objects that had been allowed to deteriorate, not merely aesthetically, but in terms of the information they carried. The gilding that had been applied over earlier gilding that revealed a different history, the marks and stamps that identified the maker and the period with a specificity that visual assessment alone could not achieve. She returned objects to positions that made historical sense, that reflected the narrative of how the collection had been built, rather than the arrangements of convenience or habit that had allowed things to drift into positions that had no logic. The Delhi Durbar in December 1911 was the most theatrical expression of the early reign's self-confidence, and May's public appearance at it was one of the most carefully calculated performances of her career. They travelled to India as Emperor and Empress of India, the monarchs of the British Empire at its greatest territorial extent, and the ceremony that received them in the amphitheatre outside Delhi was organized on the specific imperial premise that visible splendor communicated power that mere declaration could not achieve. May dressed for it with the eye of someone who understands that clothing, in a ceremonial context, is a statement about what the wearer represents, and the statement needs to be legible at the distance from which most of the audience is watching. The Cullinan diamonds, the largest gem-quality diamonds ever found, had been cut into several stones after their discovery in 1905 and presented to King Edward VII as a birthday gift from the government of the Transvaal. May wore 2 of the largest stones at Delhi in settings that made them visible without making them grotesque, the scale of the gems doing the work of the statement without requiring any supplementary announcement. She was 44 years old, and she occupied the space the ceremony required with the authority that comes from having prepared for that space since adolescence. The Indian princes who attended the ceremony, some of the most powerful figures in Asia, representatives of dynasties with their own deep histories of elaborate public ceremony, watched her and adjusted. Not because she demanded adjustment, because the adjustment was the appropriate response to something that was clearly what it presented itself as being. She came home from India with a specific satisfaction. The satisfaction of having seen the institution she represented at the scale it actually occupied in the world, and having represented it at that scale without deficiency. She was not a person who experienced satisfaction in ways that showed. The satisfaction went into the private account, alongside everything else she kept there. The war began in August 1914, with a specific problem attached to it that the palace had to manage with care and speed. The family was German, not in the way that any English family of Norman ancestry was technically French, not in the distant historical sense that could be acknowledged with a wink and a history lesson. George's formal name was George Frederick Ernest Albert, and the house he headed was the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a designation inherited from Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, whose German origins had been an asset in the mid-Victorian era of dynastic cosmopolitanism and had become a serious liability in the third year of a war in which Germany was killing British soldiers by the 100,000. Anti-German feeling in Britain during the war was not confined to editorial pages. It was riots. It was the destruction of shops with German names by crowds that did not distinguish between German-born individuals who had lived in Britain for decades and German-named institutions with no current connection to the enemy state. The Battenberg family, closely related to the royal family, changed their name to Mountbatten. Several other German-named families with royal connections made similar adjustments. The pressure was real, and the direction of the pressure was clear. The royal family's name was a different order of problem. This was not a family that had arrived in Britain and adopted a German name for prestige purposes, like some of the aspiring middle-class families who had taken Germanic names in the previous century. This was the actual ruling house of Great Britain, and changing its name would be an acknowledgement that the name had become a problem, which it had, and an acknowledgement that the family was choosing its British identity over its historical German connections, which it was. George resisted, not from any sympathy with the enemy, but from the specific conservatism of a man who understood names as part of a lineage rather than as a form of public communication. His family name was his father's name and his grandfather's name, and the link it represented to Queen Victoria and to Albert and to the generations of royal history it encoded was not something he found it easy to treat as a public relations problem to be solved. May did not argue with him directly. Direct argument was not her method when her husband's position was formed and strong. Her method was to return to the subject with information, the state of public opinion, as she understood it, presented not as judgment of George's position, but as data about the environment in which the institution was operating. The staff's concerns, the advisor's assessments, the specific ways in which the current name was appearing in contexts that were not helpful. She presented the problem in terms he could evaluate on his own terms, and she continued presenting it until he had evaluated it sufficiently. By July 1917, he was ready. On July 17, 1917, King George V issued a royal proclamation. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha would henceforth be known as the House of Windsor, a name chosen by Lord Stamfordham, the King's private secretary, from the castle in Berkshire that had been a royal residence since the 11th century and that sounded, to English ears, exactly like what it needed to sound like: permanent, British, at home in England in the way that the family needed to be understood as at home. Kaiser Wilhelm II, hearing the news from Berlin, reportedly observed that he was looking forward to attending a performance of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The remark was the kind of thing that sounds like a winning point at the time of its making, and in retrospect, merely identifies the moment when the person making it still thought they were winning. Within 16 months of the remark, the Kaiser had lost his throne, his country, and his empire, and he spent the remaining 31 years of his life in exile in the Netherlands, where he occupied himself with chopping wood and collecting woodcuts, and did not remark publicly on the British royal family's nomenclature choices. The Windsor name held. It is still the name of the house. May had pushed for it when the pushing was required, and the institution she had devoted her life to maintaining had survived the test of the war's anti-German feeling without the name that had made it, for a period, a target of the feeling. Through the war years, she also developed a public presence that reached parts of the country her formal role would not otherwise have accessed. Hospital visits, factory visits, the walks through wards of wounded soldiers from which the usual layers of ceremonial insulation were reduced. because the ceremony that accompanied a royal visit to a state occasion did not translate to a hospital ward where men were managing pain that was too immediate for ceremony to penetrate. She sat beside beds. She asked questions that showed she had been told who each man was before she arrived, which she had been, always, because she prepared for every engagement with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. The engagement was not spontaneous. The attention was real. She organized the palace on wartime terms. Rationing applied. The household reduced its consumption to demonstrate what the household understood was required of institutions, as well as individuals, when the country was at war. She was not performing the reduction. She believed in it. She believed that visible sacrifice had a specific communicative function. It told the people watching that the people at the center of national life understood what national life was costing those who were bearing the cost, and that the understanding was not merely verbal. She also continued, through all of it, the cataloguing of the royal collection. This requires a moment of attention, because the impulse to continue a project of documentary organization through a world war is the impulse of someone who has a very specific relationship to what the project means. She was not avoiding the war through the catalogue work. She was maintaining, through the war, her most fundamental argument about what the monarchy was and why it mattered. It was a continuous institution, and its continuity was evidenced in its material past, and the material past needed to be held in order, even while the present was in as much disorder as a world war produces. The continuity of the cataloguing was a form of faith in the continuity of the thing the cataloguing was documenting. She had that faith. It had been built in Florence, in the understanding that the things that lasted had outlasted the people who owned them, and that the institutions that held the things had outlasted the institutions that had held the power. She was one of the institutions that held the things. She intended to hold them properly. The palace cataloguing project in its earliest phase was not yet called that, because naming it would have required announcing it, and announcing a project of this kind was not how you pursued a project of this kind. You simply began. You began with the rooms you occupied, which was the practical starting point anyway, and you expanded outward from those rooms with the systematic patience that was her characteristic mode of working, and the expansion continued for 40 years. The specific obstacles to the project were the obstacles of institutional inertia in any large organization, the records that had been kept in multiple incompatible systems by different administrators across different reigns, the objects that had been moved without documentation so that the record said they were in one place and they were in another, the attributions that had been accepted for generations without the examination that would have confirmed or corrected them, the pieces that had arrived in the collection without any record of their arrival, because the record-keeping at the time of arrival had not been conducted with the attention that the pieces deserved. She addressed all of these systematically, beginning with the rooms she controlled and working outward, verifying attributions with the experts she engaged for that purpose, reconstructing the movement of pieces through the palace's history as far as the documentary record allowed, filling the gaps where the documentary record did not allow with the knowledge her own study had given her about what the piece was and what its history was likely to be. She also sourced. The collection had gaps that were not accidental, gaps that reflected the patterns of acquisition and disposal across several reigns, and filling those gaps was part of the project. She tracked pieces that had been in royal possession and had left it, pieces that appeared in auction records or dealer inventories, or the household inventories of country houses, and she pursued them with the specific patience of someone who is operating on a very long timeline. She was not going to acquire a piece in a hurry. She was going to acquire it when the circumstances were right, which might be next year, or might be 20 years from now, and in the meantime, she would note it and watch for it, and when the circumstances were right, she would act. The Delhi Durbar was the most dramatic single expression of the early reign's institutional self-understanding, and May's role in it was a study in the difference between ceremonial participation and ceremonial mastery. The distinction was visible to the people who had seen both versions often enough to know the difference. Most people who participated in state ceremony participated adequately, which meant that they occupied the positions assigned to them and performed the movements required, and produced the visual result that the occasion demanded. May participated at a different level, the level of someone who understood not only what the occasion required of her body and her clothing, and her position in the spatial arrangement, but what the occasion was arguing, and what it needed to argue to the specific audience watching it. The Cullinan diamonds at Delhi were not jewels she happened to be wearing. They were evidence. Evidence that the British Crown held, through its historical possession of the most spectacular natural diamonds ever found. Something that the assembled princes of India and the British Empire understood as the material equivalent of the claim the ceremony was making. That the authority she and George represented was real and was backed by the accumulated weight of what the institution had become across the centuries of its existence. She wore them with the ease of someone who has decided what they mean and who understands that the meaning only works if the wearing is easy. The war years produced a form of visible May that the country had not previously seen in quite the same way. She had always been publicly correct, publicly present, always performing the functions the position required, with the precision that was her characteristic mode. The war's circumstances produced something additional. The visible engagement with conditions that were not comfortable. The presence in places that did not require any ceremony to make them meaningful. The quality of attention she brought to the hospital wards and the factory floors that was different from the quality of attention available in a state reception. In a state reception, the form and the content exist simultaneously, and the content is the form. In a hospital ward, the form is largely absent, and the content is entirely what is happening between the people in the room. And she found that she could operate in the ward with the same effectiveness she operated in the reception, because the quality of attention she brought to both was the same. She sat beside soldiers' beds. She asked questions that showed she had read the briefing materials provided before the visit, which she always did, but which also showed that she had read them with the attention of someone who intended to use them, rather than someone who had read them as a professional duty. The men she visited sometimes wrote home about the visits, brief letters that mentioned the Queen had been there, and had known his name, and had asked the right question about the specific thing he was dealing with, and had managed the visit without the condescension that distinguished visits conducted from charitable obligation from visits conducted from genuine interest. The collecting, as it developed across the decades of her adult life, was a reputation as much as a practice. The reputation was that she admired things, and they ended up in royal residences, and the reputation was accurate in its essentials while being somewhat simplified in its mechanics. The mechanics deserve attention, because what she was doing when she collected was not the same as what a wealthy private person does when they collect, and the difference is important for understanding what the collecting meant. She had a principle, articulated in her own private correspondence and described by people who knew her well, that objects of genuine historical significance to the monarchy should be in the care of the monarchy. This principle had a defensible logic. If a piece of furniture had been commissioned by George III and had passed through a series of private hands after leaving royal ownership, it belonged in the material record of the institution that had commissioned it, rather than in the drawing room of the family that had acquired it at auction 3 generations ago. The institutional argument was real, and she made it when she was in a position to make it explicitly, and acted on it when she was not. The mechanism of the "how very handsome" was the visible expression of a practice that was considerably more systematic beneath the visible surface. Before any visit to a country house of significance, she had her people find out what was in it. Not in the way of a casual inquiry, but in the way of someone preparing a research project. What pieces were known to have royal provenance, what the family's history of acquisition contained, what the house had that the historical record indicated had once belonged to the institution she was now responsible for maintaining. She arrived at the house already knowing what she was looking for. The pausing and the look and the mild observation were not improvisations. They were the visible moment of a process that had begun weeks earlier in research. The social impossibility of refusing, the specific pressure of having Queen Mary's attention settle on a thing you owned, and having her say, "How very handsome," and then look at you. That pressure existed because the social configuration made explicit refusal unthinkable. But the selection of what to pause in front of had been made in advance, in a private office at Marlborough House, based on provenance and historical significance, and the particular intelligence that decades of research had given her. She paid for things when the transaction could be conducted as a transaction. She paid for them at prices that serious dealers would have found below market, but she paid for them rather than simply taking them, and the distinction mattered to her in the way that propriety and form mattered to her in everything. What she did not always do was make the payment optional. The offer of payment in certain configurations, particular configurations where the alternative was to give the thing without payment, because refusing to sell it was also not available, was not the same as a purchase made between equal parties with full freedom on both sides. The stories accumulated. There was the house visit in which she admired a writing desk, and the desk arrived at the palace without any very clear exchange of correspondence about whether the owners had actually decided to part with it. There was the visit in which she found in a secondary drawing room a set of chairs she identified as having been made for a royal residence in the 18th century, and which were returned to a royal residence in the 20th century, with a speed that left the family somewhat uncertain when they had agreed this was happening. There was the woman who reportedly began hiding her most significant pieces several days before a scheduled royal visit, reasoning that the Queen could not covet what the Queen could not see. The woman was right. People who hid things successfully from the advanced surveys of her household kept what they hid. People who did not hide things sufficiently, or who were visited by surprise, or who simply trusted that social convention would prevent the situation from arising, sometimes found themselves in the drawing room afterward, with a space on the shelf where a particularly handsome thing had been. One member of a country house family, speaking to Pope Hennessy in his interviews for the biography, described a specific incident in detail. The family owned a piece of Chinese porcelain of unusual quality, a piece they had possessed for several generations. When Queen Mary visited, she paused in front of it. The family knew she had paused in front of it. The family understood what the pause meant. Nothing was said. The visit continued. Lunch was served. The Queen departed with the usual expressions of pleasure. 3 weeks later, an equerry's letter arrived, and the letter was complimentary about the visit. And the letter also mentioned, in a subordinate clause of the kind that subordinate clauses are used for when the main clause is not quite sayable directly, that Her Majesty had been particularly struck by the porcelain piece in the drawing room, and that if the family should ever wish to place it with someone who could appreciate it fully, Her Majesty would be glad to receive it. The family placed it. The equerry's letter went into the fire. People who have written about this pattern have generally focused on its acquisitiveness, without fully accounting for the other thing it demonstrates, which is May's precision. She did not admire random things. She did not acquire things that were not genuinely significant. Her eye, trained across decades of the closest possible study of the British Royal Collection and its history and its gaps, identified things that were significant with accuracy, that the dealers she worked with found remarkable. She was rarely wrong about what she was looking at. She made occasional attributional errors, the kind that anyone who is looking at a great deal of things will make, but her error rate was low, and her identification of genuinely important things was consistently accurate. She also, and this is the detail that complicates the simple narrative of acquisitive pressure, genuinely believed in what she was doing. The argument that objects of royal provenance belonged in the care of the institution that had originally commissioned or owned them was an argument she held as a matter of institutional principle rather than as a post hoc justification for wanting things. She had built this argument over 50 years of thinking about what institutions are and how they make their continuity visible, and the argument was coherent. Whether the argument was sufficient to justify the specific social pressure of the mechanism, the how very handsome, and the look, is a separate question. She also kept meticulous records of what she acquired, and from whom, and what the provenance was, which is the behavior of someone who believes the record matters, who believes that the thing's history is part of the thing itself, who understands that the institutional argument is only as strong as the documentation that supports it. She was not hiding what she was doing it systematically, and recording it carefully, and making the argument, in the record she kept, that what she was doing was a legitimate exercise of institutional stewardship. The collection she assembled over the course of her adult life is now part of the Royal Collection. The Royal Collection is one of the largest and most significant art collections in the world. A meaningful portion of it is there because May spent 60 years identifying what was significant and finding ways to acquire it. This is the result that the mechanism produced. The mechanism's social problems and the result's institutional value exist simultaneously, and both of them are real. If you are still watching, you are the kind of person this channel is built for. More than half of the people who start this video never reach this point. You have. That means something. Take 30 seconds right now and subscribe if you have not already subscribed. And leave a comment telling us which part of this story you found most surprising. The comments drive the algorithm, and the algorithm is what makes videos like this one visible. We will be back with the second half of the story, and the second half is where things fall apart in ways that nobody, in 1930, could have predicted. The research that preceded each visit was not conducted by May herself at a desk with reference books. It was conducted by her household, the people whose function it was to gather and organize the information she required for any engagement she was going to undertake. And it was conducted to a standard she had established across decades of requiring it. She needed to know what was in the house she was visiting, specifically what objects of royal provenance or historical significance to the royal collection were known to be there. She needed to know the family's history of acquisition, the routes through which things had come to them, the periods, and the circumstances of the acquisition. She needed enough information to identify, in a room she had not yet entered, the specific piece or pieces whose presence there was most significant to the institutional argument she was building. The information arrived to her, and she organized it, and she went into the house knowing what she was looking for. And the pausing in front of the right object was the visible end of a process that had begun weeks earlier. The spontaneity it appeared to have was precisely the quality of attention she had spent decades learning to make look effortless, the way mastery in any domain looks effortless from outside, and is the product of sustained effort from inside. The people who hid things successfully were the people whose household staff had been thorough enough, or whose networks of information about what the Queen was likely to be interested in were good enough, to know in advance which pieces to remove before the pre-visit reconnaissance. They were not numerous. The pre-visit reconnaissance was also thorough. The people who did not hide things, or who hid them imperfectly, sometimes had the experience that they did not entirely know how to describe afterward. One account, given to Pope Hennessy by a member of a county family who had experienced the mechanism directly, described a visit in which a piece of silver, a traveling set of a kind associated with the late 17th century, had sat on a side table in the library since the family could remember, which was several generations. The Queen had paused in front of it. She had said the words. She had looked at the owner of the house. The owner of the house had smiled and agreed that yes, it was very handsome. 3 weeks later, an equerry's letter had arrived. The letter was signed by someone whose name the family recognized as belonging to the Queen's household. The letter mentioned the silver set, mentioned that Her Majesty had been particularly struck by it during the visit, and mentioned that if the family should wish to place it with someone who could ensure it was properly cared for and documented, Her Majesty would be glad to receive it. The family had replied that they would be happy for it to go to someone who would appreciate it, and the silver had been collected 2 weeks after that. The family had received in return a note of thanks and, some months later, a small gift from the royal household that was clearly selected with care and was worth considerably less than the silver set it was in exchange for. The family had told the story at dinner tables for 40 years. It was told with a specific combination of incredulity and amusement. The tone of the story that happens to you, rather than the story you made happen. The tone of someone who knows they were outmaneuvered, and who finds the outmaneuvering more interesting than enraging, now that enough time has passed. People who heard the story at those dinner tables added it to their understanding of what the pre-visit warning from the housekeeper meant, and some of them hid things accordingly, and some of them didn't. And the ones who didn't sometimes appeared at their own dinner tables with their own versions of the story. The records she kept of everything she acquired were the counter-argument to the acquisitive reputation, or would have been if the counter-argument were better known. She kept meticulous provenance records for every piece, what it was, where it had been, who she had acquired it from, what was known of its history before it came to her, and what had been discussed in the acquisition. The records were not the records of someone doing something shameful and covering it. They were the records of someone building an institutional argument and documenting the argument's evidence with the thoroughness that she believed the argument required. The collection she assembled over 60 years is now the Royal Collection, held in trust for the nation by the monarch, accessible to the public through the residences and galleries in which it is displayed, one of the largest and most significant art collections in the world. The mechanism through which it was assembled was uncomfortable for the people on the other end of it, and the discomfort was real, and the collection's cultural value is also real, and both of these things are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. And May would have recognized this formulation because she spent her entire adult life holding two true things simultaneously when they did not cancel each other out. George V died on the evening of January 20th, 1936, at Sandringham, in the room he had been born in. He was 70 years old. The last years of his life had seen his health decline, in ways that his own physicians monitored with concern, and the public was informed of with the diplomatic vagueness that characterized royal health announcements in that era. His last diary entry, made on January 17th, 3 days before his death, noted that he felt rotten. He had said something, in the final years of his reign, that people who heard it found difficult to forget. He said it about David, about his eldest son, about the man who was about to become Edward V. After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. The boy was 41 years old when his father said this. The assessment was not the product of sentimentality or wishful thinking. It was the assessment of a man who had watched his son for 4 decades and who understood, with the accuracy that proximity and love and consistent attention give, what David was capable of sustaining and what he was not. George V was right. Edward V reigned for 326 days. The problem had been visible for years to everyone who was paying attention, which included May, who paid attention to everything, and who had watched the relationship between David and Wallace Warfield Simpson develop with a clarity of perception that she found deeply alarming. Wallace Simpson was an American woman, born in Baltimore in 1896, who had been married twice before meeting David, and whose second marriage was still legally intact, though a divorce was underway, when the relationship with the Prince of Wales became impossible to manage discreetly. She was witty, self-possessed, and socially skilled in ways that David found intoxicating, ways that had nothing to do with the institutional requirements of his position, and everything to do with the personal need that his position had never been able to address. May had made inquiries about her. This is the kind of statement that sounds formal, and is actually the description of a thorough and determined private information gathering operation, conducted by someone who understood that the situation developing between her son and this woman was going to require decisions, and that decisions required accurate information. The information she gathered did not make the situation look better. She did not meet Wallace Simpson. Not once, in the decade in which Wallace was first the companion and then the fiancé, and then the wife of her eldest son. The refusal was not an expression of hot emotion, not the visible rejection of someone who was openly displaying their displeasure. It was the quiet, absolute, permanent form of a decision that had been made and was not going to be revisited. May had decided that meeting Wallace Simpson was not something she was going to do, and she went on not doing it for the remaining 15 years of her life. The crisis of 1936 developed through the autumn with the speed that crises develop when a situation has been unresolvable for years, and the specific element that makes it publicly unresolvable is finally present. The British press had maintained a remarkable silence about the relationship throughout 1935 and 1936, while the American and European press had been reporting it with considerable specificity. The discretion of the British press was not indefinite. By October 1936, it was clear that it was not going to hold much longer. By November, the outlines of the constitutional problem were visible to the people whose business it was to see constitutional problems in their early stages. The constitutional problem was this: the King of England was the supreme governor of the Church of England, and the Church of England did not permit the remarriage of divorced people whose former spouses were still alive. Both of Wallace Simpson's former husbands were still alive. The king intended to marry her. The church could not countenance the marriage. The government, consulted on the question, made clear that a marriage to Wallace Simpson would require the Prime Minister and the government to resign, which meant a constitutional crisis of a kind the monarchy could not afford to court. Edward was offered alternatives: a morganatic marriage, in which Wallace would be his wife but not his queen, was proposed as a potential solution and rejected by the governments of the dominions who were consulted. The alternatives narrowed, and as they narrowed, the situation's structure became clear. Edward could be king, or he could be with Wallace, but he could not be both. He chose Wallace. On December 10, 1936, at Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park, Edward VI signed the instrument of abdication. He was witnessed by his 3 surviving brothers. The document was brief and formal and clear. He irrevocably renounced for himself and his descendants the throne and all dignities, rights and prerogatives thereunto belonging. That evening, from Windsor Castle, he gave a radio address to the British nation and the world, the now famous broadcast in which he said that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge his duties as king, as he would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman he loved. May listened to the broadcast. Her private correspondence from this period does not describe precisely how she listened or precisely what she felt in the moment of listening, because her private correspondence does not describe her internal experience with that kind of directness. What can be said is that she had known this was coming, had known for months that the situation had no resolution that did not involve either the marriage or the abdication, and had watched it approach with the focused dread of someone who has accurately assessed a trajectory and cannot alter it. She wrote to Edward after the abdication. The letter was warm in the register she could access, the epistolary warmth that was her reliable mode, and it acknowledged the difficulty of what had happened, and expressed the care for him that she genuinely felt. He read the warmth as forgiveness. He was wrong. What he had read as forgiveness was the warmth of a mother who loved her son and simultaneously could not classify what her son had done as anything other than an institutional failure of the most serious kind. These two things existed in her simultaneously, the maternal love and the institutional judgment, and they did not cancel each other out. She held both for the rest of her life. Edward married Wallis Simpson in June 1937 in France. He visited Germany in October of the same year and met Adolf Hitler, a meeting that generated a volume of documented British government anxiety that makes the visit's purpose difficult to characterize charitably. He was made governor of the Bahamas during the war, which was a position that placed him at a sufficient remove from the centers of European conflict for the British government to feel confident that his presence there was as useful as it was manageable. He lived in France for most of the post-war decades, in the exile that the abdication had created, and he and Wallis visited Britain occasionally and were received by the royal family on the formal occasions that courtesy required. He visited May twice after the war, at Marlborough House. Their relationship in those visits was described by the people present as correct and warm in its surface forms and essentially unchanged in its underlying structure, which was that of a son who felt he had not entirely failed his family, and a mother who knew he had and had not altered her assessment. The visits were not painful in any visible sense. They were the visits of two people who understood that a specific thing had happened, and that the specific thing had changed the relationship in a specific way, and that the changed relationship was now the relationship. And you conducted it on those terms, because conducting it on other terms was not available to either of you. He did not understand for a long time that she had not forgiven the abdication. He thought the warmth of the letters and the correctness of the visits meant that the thing was behind them, or at least negotiable, that the years of good behavior had done the work that years of good behavior sometimes do. He raised the question, on one of the visits, of whether Wallis might be received by the Queen. He was told that this was not possible. He raised the question again. He was told again. The answer did not change. May never met Wallis Simpson. She died without having met her. The refusal was not performed, and was not warm, and was not cruel. It was simply permanent, which is its own category entirely. Albert became George VI on December 11, 1936, the day after the abdication, and he was not ready. Not in the sense of lacking the fundamental qualities the position required, because he had those, the steadiness and the work ethic, and the genuine commitment to the institution that his brother had never quite developed. He was not ready in the sense of having been prepared, because the preparation that should have been his had been organized around the assumption that the throne was his brother's responsibility and his own role was a supporting one. The stammer, which had improved substantially with Logue's help but had not disappeared, was the specific embodiment of the general condition. He could function at the level required, but functioning required more of him than it would have required of someone for whom it had always been expected. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who became Queen Consort, was a source of public warmth that the new reign needed urgently. She was not like May. She was warm in the spontaneous physical sense, the way of being warm that May could not access, and she communicated that warmth publicly, in ways that May had never communicated anything publicly. The public found her accessible and lovable and responsive to them in ways that May had never been accessible or responsive. The comparison was made, and May was aware of the comparison, and the awareness produced something in her that was not quite resentment, but was the recognition that her particular qualities were being measured against qualities of a different kind, and that the measurement was not entirely to her advantage. She and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had a relationship that was correct and functional and essentially incompatible in a way that both of them managed with the tools available to them. May's tools were institutional. She transferred the deference appropriate to a queen consort to her daughter-in-law without requiring any additional acknowledgement of their previous relationship. Elizabeth's tools were personal. She managed the incompatibility through the warmth that was her characteristic mode, deploying it toward the older woman in ways that May accepted, but could not reciprocate in kind. They were not enemies. They were not close. They were two women managing the institutional relationship between them with the professional commitment that the institution required, and they managed it successfully for 26 years. The abdication had tested the monarchy in ways that people outside it had not fully understood, and people inside it had understood with frightening clarity. The institution had survived the test, partly because Albert was there, and partially because the country, offered the choice between the king they had and the abdication that removed him, chose in such numbers to express their preference for the institution over the individual that the institution's survival was not ultimately in question. But the fact of the test was itself a form of damage. The monarchy had demonstrated that it could be challenged from inside in the most damaging way, by the person who was its symbolic center, choosing his personal life over his institutional function. May spent the years after the abdication working, as she had always worked, on the project of the collection and the project of the institution's public image, and the project of being, in her person, the visible evidence that the institution was more durable than its most recent disruption. She was 69 when the abdication happened. She was old enough to have been managing this institution for longer than most of the people currently watching it had been alive, and the weight of that accumulated management was, in its way, part of the counter-argument to the abdication's damage. Things that have been maintained this carefully and this long do not simply dissolve because one person chose wrongly. She was evidence of this argument. She continued to be evidence of it. The October to December 1936 timeline has the compressed inevitability, in retrospect, of the trajectory of something that has been moving for a long time and is now arriving at its destination. But the speed with which the public understanding caught up to what the private knowledge had been tracking is itself a feature of the crisis worth attending to, because the gap between private and public knowledge in cases of this kind tells you something about how institutions manage their most serious internal difficulties. By the time the British public became aware, in early December, that the king was proposing to marry a twice-divorced American woman, and that this would require the resolution of a constitutional impossibility, the people inside the government and the palace had been managing this knowledge for several months. The Prime Minister had known clearly since at least the summer. The constitutional officers had known. The Dominion's governments had been consulted on their position on the morganatic marriage proposal and had communicated that position. The process of exploring available resolutions and finding that each led to the same constitutional impossibility had been completed before the first British newspaper published a word about the situation. May's knowledge was longer than most of the inside participants. She had been tracking the situation with the attention she brought to anything that touched the institution she was responsible for, and her assessment of what David was going to do when the choice was forced was not a guess. It was the product of 40 years of observation and the specific clarity that comes from being willing to believe what the observation has told you, rather than what you would prefer to believe instead. She wrote in her diary during the crisis period, with an economy that was characteristic. The entries for October and November 1936 are brief, factual, externally organized: the weather, the appointments, the events attended. The internal experience is not in the diary, because the diary was a document of events, rather than a document of her response to events. But the brevity of the late 1936 entries, in the context of a diary maintained with steady thoroughness through decades of ordinary time, carries its own communication to the person reading it across the subsequent years. She met with the Prime Minister. She received communications from people within the palace structure who kept her informed of the constitutional situation's development. She was not passive. She had never been passive in situations affecting the institution she had committed her adult life to. But what she could not do was change what David was going to choose. She had known for years what the fundamental choice was going to be, when the fundamental choice was forced. You cannot be 40 years worth of accurate about a person and then be wrong about the decision that 40 years of watching has been telling you they are going to make. The broadcast on the evening of December 10 was received with the complex public response that genuine human situations with institutional dimensions produce. The people who valued the romantic dimension found it moving. The people who valued the constitutional dimension found it a dereliction. Most found it both, and held both in the specific discomfort of an occasion on which a real love story and a real institutional failure were the same event. The broadcast was technically brilliant as a piece of public communication, and it was the statement of a man surrendering the thing that the people listening had organized their understanding of stability around. And it was both of these things simultaneously, and neither cancelled the other. The letter May wrote to him afterward has been read selectively, the warmth extracted and cited as evidence that the relationship continued in something like its previous form. In full context, the letter performs several functions at once: genuine maternal care, the epistolary warmth that was her consistent mode with people she loved, and the position of someone whose institutional judgment on what had happened was entirely clear and was not softened by the warmth, because the warmth and the judgment were not in the same register and did not affect each other. Edward read the warmth. He did not read the judgment. He was wrong that the rupture was healing. The rupture was permanent. The warmth was real. Both were true at the same time, and both remained true until she died. George VI was a king who had been made by difficulty rather than by expectation, and the difference showed in the specific quality of his public presence during the years that followed the abdication. He was steady in the plain sense of steady. He turned up. He prepared. He did the work. He held the position without the glamour that his brother had projected, and without the need for the glamour's compensations that had driven his brother to surrender the position. He was not charismatic in any conventional sense. He was reliable. In the years that were coming, reliability was going to matter considerably more than charisma. His mother watched his reign with a combination of pride and concern, and the proportions shifted depending on the year. She was proud of what he was managing to do, and concerned about the cost of managing it, because she could see the cost in ways that the public could not. She had watched Albert for 50 years, and she knew the difference between Albert performing adequacy and Albert performing adequacy while carrying costs that he was not sharing with anyone. The costs were there. She could see them. The war came in September 1939, which was to say it came inevitably, after a year of diplomatic management of the Hitler situation that had produced Munich, and the contempt of the people who had been right about Hitler all along, for the people who had thought Munich might work. George VI and the government and the royal family faced a set of decisions about where to be and what to do during the coming period that were the kinds of decisions that become, in retrospect, either obviously correct or obviously wrong, depending on what the period produces. The decision to remain in London, or at least to continue to appear in London even when evacuation to somewhere safer might have seemed appropriate, was a decision that made the monarchy's relationship with the civilian population it was asking to sustain an unprecedented level of hardship significantly more credible. When Buckingham Palace was bombed in September 1940, the Queen's reported observation was that now they could look the East End in the face, and the observation, whether or not those were precisely her words, was precisely the right observation. It acknowledged the relation between what the palace was experiencing and what the bombed streets of East London were experiencing, and the acknowledgement was what the situation required. May was not in London. This is the part of the wartime record that is sometimes misunderstood. The question of what to do with the Queen Dowager, the elderly mother of the king who was also herself one of the most significant figures in the royal family's public life, was a real logistical and security question, and the answer that was arrived at was Badminton House in Gloucestershire. Badminton House was the seat of the Dukes of Beaufort, and the Duchess of Beaufort was Mary Cambridge, a niece of May's, the daughter of May's brother, the Duke of Teck, and Adolphus Cambridge. The family connection made the arrangement personal, rather than merely institutional. and the Duchess of Beaufort, who was a practical woman of considerable organizational capability, offered the house as a wartime residence for the Queen Dowager, and made the offer sincerely, with whatever degree of understanding of what she was actually agreeing to was available to her at the time. She may not have fully understood what she was agreeing to. May arrived at Badminton in early September 1939 with 70 pieces of luggage and 55 members of her household staff. The 70 pieces of luggage contained, among other things, the working materials for the cataloguing project that was her most sustained private occupation, because the cataloguing project was not going to pause for a world war. The household staff included the personal attendants and secretaries and the support infrastructure that a royal establishment required to function. And the function of a royal establishment was not suspended during a war, it was adapted to the conditions of a war, but the function continued. The Duchess of Beaufort received her aunt and the aunt's household and proceeded to accommodate both within a house that was very large, by normal standards, and not quite large enough by the standards of what had arrived in it. The rooms were divided between what the Duchess had been using and what the Queen Dowager's household required, and the division required adjustments on both sides, and the adjustments were more extensive on the Duchess's side than they were on the Queen Dowager's. May settled into Badminton with the systematic attention she brought to every space she occupied. She arranged the rooms she was using to her satisfaction, which meant rearranging them from the arrangement the Duchess had established, because her satisfaction and the Duchess's satisfaction were two different things. She established the routines that were her natural mode, the specific hours for the specific activities, the schedule that gave every day a shape that did not allow for the drift she considered incompatible with productive existence. She applied herself to the cataloguing work, working through the materials she had brought with her, corresponding with dealers and experts, and the keepers of the collections she was documenting, maintaining the project's momentum through the changed conditions, without apparent concession to the change. She was not unhappy at Badminton. This bears saying because the picture of a very senior royal woman removed from her London residence and deposited in a country house in Gloucestershire for the duration of a world war might suggest unhappiness, or at least significant disruption to a life organized around very specific conditions. What it suggests about May specifically is something more interesting. She found Badminton's situation of active necessity more congenial than many of the ceremonially structured occasions of her London life. There was work to do, work that was legible and physical, and connected to a visible outcome. This appealed to something in her that the formal rounds of the royal year did not always appeal to in quite the same way. The ivy was one expression of this. She looked out of a window one morning and saw the wall of the house covered in a substantial growth of ivy. She had always objected to ivy on walls. She objected to it on horticultural grounds, having formed the view that ivy damaged stonework, and the horticultural grounds were defensible, because ivy does in fact damage stonework. She summoned her equerry, Sir John Coke, and informed him that they would be clearing the ivy that morning. What began as a morning project expanded considerably beyond a morning scope. The ivy on the house walls was addressed. The ivy on the trees throughout the estate was addressed. The undergrowth in the woodland areas of the estate was addressed. What became known among the Badminton household as the Ivy Squad worked through the estate with a systematic thoroughness that was entirely characteristic of the person who had organized it, and the work extended over months rather than the single morning in which it had originated. The Duke of Beaufort, returning from military duties on leave, observed that the estate was considerably tidier than it had been when he left, and that the specific character of the tidiness was unmistakably not his. She collected salvage for the war effort. She visited factories and military hospitals and local institutions with the same prepared, purposeful attention she brought to public engagements in London. She organized her household's contributions to wartime requirements. She read, widely and without the hierarchical preferences of someone who had decided that only certain kinds of books were appropriate to her station. She read Crime and Punishment during this period, which is a novel about a young man who commits murder, under the theory that exceptional individuals are not bound by ordinary moral rules, and who discovers, through the suffering that follows the murder, that the theory was wrong. A woman who had spent 60 years maintaining the primacy of institutional rules over personal feeling, reading a novel about the catastrophic consequences of deciding that you are above those rules. At the moment when her eldest son was living in exile as the consequence of exactly that decision, the connection is there in the record and does not require embellishment. She returned to London after the war ended, to Marlborough House, which had been requisitioned during the war and required significant restoration before it was habitable again. The restoration was organized with her characteristic attention to the proper state of things, the work supervised by people who understood what proper state meant in the context of a house whose contents she knew better than anyone alive. She was 78 years old when the war ended. Her health was declining in the gradual way of healthy old age, nothing catastrophic, nothing that required immediate medical crisis management, but the accumulation of time's effects on a body that had been very robust for a very long time and was now requiring more maintenance than it previously had. She moved more slowly. She tired more readily. The public engagements were paced more carefully than they had once been paced. The cataloguing continued. It would continue until it was no longer possible for it to continue, because the cataloguing was not an optional project that could be set aside when other demands arrived. It was the primary project. Everything else fitted around it. George VI's health had been in observable decline since the later 1940s. He had smoked heavily throughout his adult life, as men of his generation and class typically did, and the consequences of the smoking were becoming clear in the ways that these consequences became clear in that era. First as a general decline in vigor, then as a specific condition that required medical investigation, then as the diagnosis that the medical investigation produced. In 1951, it was announced that he had undergone a lung operation, described in the careful language of official medical announcements, and that the operation had been successful. The success was relative. Through the autumn and winter of 1951, his public appearances were reduced, and his energy was visibly diminished, and the adjustments his schedule required told the people paying attention what the people paying attention understood. Princess Elizabeth and her husband Prince Philip departed for a Commonwealth tour in early February 1952. The king was photographed at the airport seeing them off. The photographs were among the last taken of him. On the morning of February 6, 1952, he was found dead at Sandringham by his valet. He had died in his sleep, which was identified after the fact as the consequence of a coronary thrombosis. He was 56 years old. The work at Badminton was also, in a way that the word work does not quite capture, a form of testimony. She was testifying, through the daily continuation of the cataloguing project, and the daily maintenance of the household's routines, and the weekly visits to factories and hospitals and local institutions, to the institution's continuity, under conditions that were testing continuity in every other dimension of British life. The physical fabric of cities was being destroyed. The class structure that had organized social life was being renegotiated by the shared experience of bombing and rationing, and military service across class lines. The empire whose weight had given the monarchy its largest claim to world significance was beginning the visible contraction that would within 2 decades essentially dissolve it. May held the line. The line was the thing that could be held, and holding it was what she had been built for. The Duchess of Beaufort managed the occupation of her house by the Queen Dowager's household with the competence and the discretion that the situation required of her. The two women maintained a relationship of genuine warmth and occasional negotiation about whose organization of the household was going to prevail in which rooms, and the negotiation was conducted with the tact of two people who understand that they are performing their relationship in a context that will eventually be historically documented, and that requires a public performance of harmony alongside the private management of friction. The Ivy clearance extended considerably past the initial morning of it. May organized what the Badminton household came to call the Wooding Squad, a group of estate workers supervised by a member of her household staff who cleared fallen and dead timber from the estate's woodland areas with the same systematic thoroughness as the Ivy. The Duke of Beaufort returned on leave from his military duties to find the estate looking significantly more like May's opinion of what an estate should look like than his own. The Duchess mediated. The Wooding Squad continued. May visited factories during the war years with a preparation that the factory managers found distinctive. She was briefed on who worked there and what they made, and what the war's requirements were specifically asking of the workers, and she used this information in the conversations she had with those workers, which produced the specific effect of visits conducted from genuine information rather than ceremonial obligation. The people she visited felt that the visitor understood what they were doing, which was not always the case with important visitors, and which mattered considerably to people doing difficult work in difficult conditions. Crime and Punishment was at Badminton. She read it carefully, which was the only way she read anything. A novel about a man who kills, and who justifies the killing, on the grounds that exceptional individuals are not bound by the rules that govern ordinary ones, and who discovers through the experience of having killed that the rules are not external impositions, that the exceptional can exempt themselves from, but are conditions of being able to live with oneself. Read by a woman who had spent 60 years maintaining the primacy of institutional obligation over personal preference, at the moment when her eldest son was living in exile in France, as the consequence of having decided that his personal preference outweighed his institutional obligation. The connection is in the historical record. She read the book all the way through. May was 84 years old when her second son died. She had outlived her husband by 16 years. She had outlived a fiancé. She had outlived 2 of her 6 children, George in the aircraft crash of 1942 and John in the seizure of 1919. And now she had outlived Albert, who had become George VI under circumstances neither of them would have chosen, and who had carried the crown through the worst decade the British monarchy had faced since the Civil War, with a steadiness that had cost him everything he had to spend. He was 56. She was 84. She received the news with the composure that the people around her had learned to expect, and that the people who had not known her before the event sometimes found difficult to comprehend. She did not break down in any visible form. She wrote the letters that needed writing. She appeared at the events that required her appearance. She organized the process of her grief the way she had organized everything, systematically, privately, with the external form maintained precisely while the interior was managed in ways that only the interior had access to. What she actually felt at the death of her second son cannot be reconstructed from the record, because she had spent more than 6 decades building a record that did not contain direct access to what she actually felt. The management was complete. The letters from this period are kind and measured, and genuinely felt in the particular register of feeling that she expressed in letters, but they are not the letters of someone whose wall had finally come down. They are the letters of someone who is managing a very large loss with the very sophisticated management tools that a very long life of managing very large things had developed. She had one thing left to want. She wanted to live long enough to see her granddaughter crowned. Elizabeth had become queen on the morning of her father's death at Sandringham, on the other side of the world, in a game lodge in Kenya where she and Philip had been staying as part of the Commonwealth tour that the king had been well enough to see them depart for, but not well enough to survive their return from. She came home as queen. She was 25 years old. She had been prepared for this role in the way that heirs are prepared when the role is acknowledged to be coming, with attention to the institutions and protocols and requirements of the position. She had not been prepared in the way that heirs are prepared when the role is expected imminently, with the specific urgency of someone who knows the window is short. She had, however, been observing her grandmother for her entire life. The observation was not casual. May had always been present in Elizabeth's life, in the specific way of someone whose presence produces understanding, through the quality of the presence, rather than through explicit instruction. Elizabeth had watched her grandmother move through rooms and manage situations, and deploy the precise resource of her attention, in the service of the institution they both served, and she had been watching with the attentiveness that her grandmother's own example had taught her to bring to everything she watched. The lessons were not lectures, they were demonstrations, and Elizabeth was an excellent student of demonstrations. May spoke more openly to Elizabeth in the months after George VI's death than she spoke to most people, which is to say that she was candid in the way of someone who has decided that candor is the appropriate mode for this specific relationship in this specific circumstance, and who has a great deal to be candid about. She had been inside the institution for 60 years. She had opinions about it, about the people in it, about the things that had worked and the things that had not, about the decisions that needed to be made, and the manner in which they needed to be made. She had observations about Elizabeth specifically, about the qualities she could see in her granddaughter that the position would need, about the qualities that would be tested in ways Elizabeth had not yet been tested. She respected Elizabeth. This was not automatic. May had not respected everyone who had occupied the royal positions she observed. She had respected the ones who understood what the positions required and were willing to pay the cost of the understanding, and she did not respect the ones who treated the position as an entitlement or as a vehicle for personal satisfaction. Elizabeth was in the first category. May could see this, had been watching it develop since the abdication had first made the little girl's future crown visible, and her respect for it was the genuine article. She wanted to be at the coronation. She had organized her medical situation, insofar as it was organizable, around the date of June 2nd, 1953, the date the coronation had been set for. The preparation required by a state ceremony of that scale takes considerable time, and the schedule had been set in the months following George VI's death, and May had been told the date and had incorporated the date into her understanding of what she needed to do between the present and the date, which was primarily to continue to be alive. In late January 1953, she became ill with a respiratory infection. She was 85 years old, and it was January in England, and the combination of those two facts meant that a respiratory infection was not a temporary inconvenience of the kind that passes in a week. It was a statement about the limits of what an 85-year-old body can manage when pushed by the particular persistence of the English winter. She did not go to hospital. She remained at Marlborough House, in the rooms she had arranged and the collection she had spent her life assembling, and she managed the illness with the same determined attention she brought to everything. She grew worse. Her household understood what worse meant at 85, with this infection, in this winter. The family was told. They came. Elizabeth came. The other senior members of the family came. They sat with her during the final days, which she spent largely conscious, in the specific way of someone who has been conscious throughout everything else, and sees no reason to stop being conscious now. The accounts of the people who were present describe a woman who remained in possession of herself until very near the end, which was the accurate summary of her entire life. She died on March 24th, 1953. The coronation was June 2nd, 1953. 10 weeks. The coronation went ahead without her, as she had known it would go ahead, and as she had not quite stopped hoping it would not. Westminster Abbey, June 2nd, 1953. Elizabeth II, crowned before a congregation that included the senior members of the royal family, the representatives of the Commonwealth, the representatives of foreign states, the holders of the great offices of the United Kingdom, the people whose presence at this ceremony was required by the specific history of the institution whose continuity the ceremony was marking. The ceremony was exactly what May would have wanted it to be: precise, weighty with historical significance, conducted with the seriousness she believed that genuine ceremony required of the people performing it. She was not there. The gap between her death and the coronation is the final event in a life that produced more than its share of events, and it is the event that says something essential about her life that the other events, with all their drama and weight, cannot quite say. She had spent 85 years doing everything she was required to do, and more than that, doing everything that was not required of her, but that she had decided was required of the institution she served. She had catalogued the collection. She had pushed for the Windsor name change. She had managed the abdication without losing her composure or her position or her clarity about what the institution needed. She had organized badminton into something useful during a war. She had maintained, through all of it, the standards she had decided on as a girl in a borrowed house in Richmond Park, and she had maintained them without exception and without the accommodation of her own comfort or convenience that most people permit themselves in the name of being human. She had done all of this, and she had not quite lasted long enough to see what it had built. The 10-week gap is unfair, but fairness was not the standard by which her life had ever been measured, and she would have been the first to say so. The standard was something else: continuity, the institution enduring, the thing she had maintained being maintained after she was no longer there to maintain it. What May gave Elizabeth in the months between George VI's death and the coronation was the transfer that happens between one generation's holding and the next. Not a formal handing over. May did not have documents to sign or official ceremonies to conduct. What she had was time, and what the time contained was the 60 years she had spent inside the machinery of the crown, and she gave what she could give of it to the person who was going to inherit the machinery. She talked to Elizabeth about the specific people who populated the extended family and the court, who was reliable in what kinds of situations, and who was less reliable in what kinds of situations, who understood what the position required, and who treated the position as an entitlement rather than a function, whose advice was worth seeking, and whose advice needed to be received politely and not followed. This was the intelligence that can only come from decades of direct observation, and it was intelligence that no briefing document or historical account could provide, because it was about the specific individuals currently in the positions, rather than the positions in the abstract. She talked to Elizabeth about the cataloguing project, and what it had achieved, and what remained to be done. She had spent 40 years building the institutional argument for the monarchy's material past, and the argument was still being built, was in fact a project that would not be complete within any single lifetime, and she wanted Elizabeth to understand both the argument and its importance in terms specific enough that the project would continue. She talked to Elizabeth about the difficult situations she had managed and how she had managed them: the abdication, the Windsor name change, the wartime decisions, the post-abdication estrangement from Edward, the management of her relationship with Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon over 2.5 decades, not as a set of lessons or instructions, but as the account of a person sharing what they had done and how it had worked, and what the working had cost, which is the form that real knowledge transfer takes between people who both understand what they are doing. Elizabeth listened. She had been listening to her grandmother for her entire life, but the listening in these final months had a different quality. The quality of listening that occurs when you understand that the time for the listening is limited, and that what is being said is the distillation of something enormous into the time available for the distillation. She asked questions. She had always been the kind of person who asked questions rather than waiting to be told, which is the quality of a person who understands that asking is how you get the information that the person across from you has that you need. May found the questions satisfying in the specific way that good questions are satisfying to people who have thought carefully about something. They confirmed that the understanding was being received at the level of depth at which it was being offered. She respected Elizabeth in the plain, direct sense of someone who has decided that a specific person merits respect, and whose respect, because it is not given easily, means something when it is given. She had watched Elizabeth being formed by the specific conditions of an unusual childhood: a father who became king under circumstances that had not been planned, a mother whose warmth was the public complement to what Elizabeth's own character was quietly becoming, a grandmother who was demonstrating continuously what the institutional commitment looked like when it was fully made and fully sustained. Elizabeth had made her own commitments inside those conditions, and the commitments were real, and May could see them. The 10 weeks between May's death and the coronation of June 2 are the gap that people notice, and that has the quality of the almost. She came so close. The illness arrived in late January and progressed through February and March, with the persistence of illness in an 85-year-old body, which is a different rate of progression than illness in a younger body. Not necessarily faster, but less negotiable. The body has fewer reserves to draw on, fewer mechanisms for recovery, less margin between the illness and the thing it leads to. She remained at Marlborough House. Her household understood what remaining there meant, which was that she was choosing to die in her own rooms, in the collection she had built, surrounded by the evidence of the institutional argument she had spent her life making, rather than in a hospital or in any space that was not organized around what she had organized her life around. The family came. They sat with her in the rooms that she had arranged. They were with her in the manner of people who are with someone at the end, and who are doing the thing that is available to them to do, which is to be present and to continue being present. She died on the morning of March 24th. She had wanted to be at the coronation. The coronation was 10 weeks later. The two facts exist in the record without mitigation and without the consolation that people sometimes try to apply to such facts. She did not quite reach the thing she had been working toward. The thing she had been working toward happened anyway, because that is what institutions that are held carefully do. They continue past the people who held them, which was what she had been arguing for 60 years. The question the title of this video asks, why the royals feared Queen Mary so much, is actually several different questions that wear the appearance of one question. Each of the people who feared her was afraid of something specific, and the specific fear was different for different people, and understanding the differences tells you more about both the person and the thing they were afraid of. The household staff who moved things before her arrival were afraid of her judgment. Her judgment was accurate, impersonal, and comprehensive. She noticed everything and assessed everything, and the standard against which things were assessed was fixed and known and applied without exception. This is considerably more frightening than judgment that is arbitrary or biased or inconsistent. Arbitrary judgment can sometimes be managed by luck or charm. Accurate, impersonal judgment cannot be managed at all. You either meet the standard or you do not, and she always knew which was the case. The country house hostesses who hid their best pieces were afraid of the social mechanism that left them without options. The how very handsome and the look had created a social configuration in which the correct behavior was clear, and the deviation from the correct behavior was unthinkable. And the correct behavior involved losing something you had not planned to lose. What they feared was not cruelty but the absence of the room to maneuver that cruelty, paradoxically, sometimes leaves. Cruelty can be appealed. A social configuration that leaves no room for appeal cannot be appealed. The daughters-in-law were afraid of her standards. She had standards for everything, for the management of a royal household, for the conduct of public appearances, for the relationship between personal preference and institutional requirement. The standards were not negotiable, were not softened by relationship, were not adjusted for the personal qualities of the woman being assessed against them. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who was warm and skilled and publicly beloved in ways that May had never been, and perhaps had never tried to be, was still aware that the older woman's assessment of her performance as queen consort was being conducted against a standard that the warmth did not affect. The standard measured institutional function. The warmth was something else. Both could be true simultaneously. The children feared her in the way that children who need something their parent cannot give are sometimes afraid of that parent. Not afraid of violence or punishment in the crude sense, afraid of the gap between the love they could feel in her letters and the warmth they could not feel in her presence. The gap between what she was capable of, which was clearly a great deal, and what she gave them, which was sufficient in every practical sense, and insufficient in the one sense that most mattered to most children, the sense of being simply, physically, warmly present with them when they were distressed. That gap made her frightening because it implied that the warmth was available somewhere, was being managed rather than given, and children who understand that they are being managed rather than held are afraid in a way that does not fully resolve with adulthood. Edward was afraid of her because she was right about him, and he knew it. She had assessed him accurately across 4 decades of observation, had understood what he was capable of sustaining and what he was not, had seen the choice he would make before he had quite made it, and had been unable to prevent the making of it. His abdication was the choice of a man who had decided that his personal needs took priority over his institutional function. She would never have made that choice. She could not quite understand the choosing of it. The distance between those two positions was an entire human life of different understanding, and they never closed it. Albert was afraid of her in the way that people who love someone who cannot show love in the form they need are afraid. Afraid that the deficiency is in themselves, afraid that no amount of effort will close a gap whose origin is not in their effort, but in a different kind of distance. He was not wrong about the distance. The distance was real, but the love was also real, and he knew the love was real. And spending your life understanding that you are loved at a distance by someone who cannot reduce the distance is a specific form of grief that does not get easier with time. She was afraid of something herself. This is the part that most accounts of her do not address, and the part that makes everything else legible. She was afraid of what she had been at the beginning, the girl in the borrowed house whose mother could not stop spending money that did not exist. The girl in Florence learning from the Medici's empty palaces what happens to the people when the power fails and only the objects remain. The teenager who came back to London from exile, knowing that warmth was not protection, and charm was not protection, and rank without resources was not protection, and that the only reliable protection was control. Control of rooms, of objects, of behavior, of the machinery of an institution, maintained carefully enough to outlast the individual failures of the people inside it. She was afraid, beneath all the armor, of returning to the position of the girl who had no control, the girl at the mercy of her mother's warmth and her father's charm, and the creditor's impatience, and the Queen Victoria's continued willingness to let the family live in her houses. The girl whose future was entirely contingent on other people's decisions about her future. She had spent her entire adult life ensuring that she never returned to that position, and the armor she had built to prevent the return was the armor that everyone who encountered her felt when they encountered her. The immovability, the precision, the comprehensive refusal to be found in any condition that resembled vulnerability. The royals feared her because the armor was perfect. You cannot get through perfect armor, and when you cannot get through armor, you stop looking for the person inside and start responding to the armor. The armor was extraordinary. It had been built with extraordinary care and maintained with extraordinary discipline for more than 6 decades, and it produced an institution, at the end of it, that was more orderly and better documented and more clearly continuous in its self-understanding than it had been when she arrived at it. It also produced children who needed something the armor could not give them, and a dynasty that carried those needs forward in its own ways. Edward needed an escape, and found one that cost everyone around him the thing they most valued. Albert needed unconditional presence, and found it in the woman he married, and carried the cost of not having had it earlier, into a reign that was remarkable, partly for how much it required him to carry. Elizabeth needed the grandmother who showed her what the crown required, and she received that, and she carried it forward for 70 years. May built the armor because she was afraid. The armor protected her and cost her children. The cost was real. The protection was real. The institution that her 60 years of protected, armored, systematic service produced is still here. Whether the price was worth it is a question that belongs to the people who paid it. She had already answered it, decades ago, and she was not the sort of woman who revisited her answers once they were made. She got up every morning for 85 years, and she maintained the thing. That is what she did. She maintained the thing. There is also a form of fear that doesn't have a comfortable name. The fear that arises not from threat of punishment or social consequence, but from the proximity of someone who is much more clearly what they are than you are. The fear of the person who has no meaningful gap between what they intend and what they do, who has organized their existence around the alignment of intention and action, and maintained that alignment over such a long period that the alignment is no longer discipline, but fact of character. Being near that kind of alignment, when your own gap is of ordinary human dimensions, is uncomfortable not because anything is threatening you, but because the proximity makes the gap visible to you in ways it isn't visible from inside ordinary life. The senior members of the royal family, who had to conduct their business in her presence for decades, experienced this discomfort in its sustained form. She was not comparing them to herself explicitly. She was simply being what she was completely, and the completeness was itself the comparison. The courtier who had not done the work required found himself near someone for whom not doing the work required was not a category that existed. This is not a comfortable situation to be in repeatedly, and it produces either the serious upgrading of one's own standards or the retreat from the radius of the comparison, and many people chose the retreat. What she actually wanted, in the private ledger of wants she maintained with the same precision she maintained everything, is harder to reconstruct than what she was afraid of, because fear is a more articulate motivator than desire in people who have organized themselves primarily around avoiding rather than achieving. She was afraid of the borrowed house, and she wanted the permanent one, and she got it. She was afraid of the performance of confidence without the substance beneath it, and she wanted the substance, and she built it. Across 60 years of the expertise and knowledge and institutional argument that gave the performance its foundation. She was afraid of being managed by other people's decisions about her future, and she wanted the management of her own circumstances, which she achieved in the specific form available to a woman in the British royal family in the early 20th century, which was not personal autonomy in the broad sense, but the management of the institution she inhabited, which was everything that mattered. She got what she was afraid of not getting. The price was the things she gave to the institution and could not give to the children. The children paid the price. The institution received the gift. Both of these facts are entirely real, and neither cancels the other. Elizabeth II held the crown for 70 years. She died in September 2022 at Balmoral, in the kind of death that people who have lived as she lived tend to die, working until close to the end, fully herself, having organized a life around an institution, with the thoroughness her grandmother had demonstrated to her, across the 26 years she had to watch the demonstration. Whether she found it sufficient, whether the institution she maintained at the cost she paid was worth the cost, is a question she took with her. What remains is the institution, still standing, still performing its functions, still bearing the specific imprint of the two women who held it most fully across the 20th century. The housekeeper's warning before the visit. The objects that disappeared overnight, the 2-second look and the mild observation. The letter to Edward after the abdication that was read as forgiveness and was not forgiveness. The 10 weeks between the death and the coronation. These are the specific forms that a life organized around a single sustained commitment produced when it intersected with the ordinary human circumstances of loss and love and the passage of time. The forms are strange, the commitment was real, what it built is still here. The fear that each group had of her was real, and the reality of the fear was produced by the specific quality of what they were afraid of, which in each case was not the same thing. The household staff feared accurate impersonal judgment. The country house hostesses feared the social configuration with no exit. The daughters-in-law feared the standard applied without adjustment. The children feared the gap between the love they knew was real and the warmth they needed that was not available in the form they needed it. Edward feared her accuracy about him. Albert feared the gap in a different form, the form of the person you love who cannot give you the thing you most need from them, which is different from the form of the person who has judged you accurately, and you cannot make yourself into the person who would have passed the judgment. The foreign dignitaries who encountered her in formal settings feared something else, the specific quality of a person who knows more about the thing you are both representing than you do, who has been inside the institution for longer than you have been inside yours, and who carries that tenure in every aspect of how she occupies the room. State occasions are performances conducted by people who know they are performing, and the best state performers are the people who have so completely inhabited the role that the inhabiting is no longer performance but fact. She had inhabited the role for 60 years. By the time she was in her 70s, she was not performing the Queen Dowager. She was the Queen Dowager, and the distinction was perceptible across the room, without the person perceiving it being able to fully articulate what they were perceiving. She was also, and this bears saying once more, because it is the part that makes everything else legible, afraid. The fear that had built the armor was still present at 85, not as the acute dread of the girl in Florence, but as the background condition of a person who built their entire adult existence around the management of what they feared losing. She had never lost the borrowed floor feeling. She had converted it into a 60-year project of building the opposite of the borrowed floor, the owned ground, the documented collection, the maintained institution, the position that could not be taken away because it was not borrowed but earned. The earning was continuous, the floor was permanent now, but the awareness of how the floor had once felt, the specific texture of contingency, the specific knowledge of what it meant to live in someone else's decision about your presence, that she carried too. The children she had were the children she produced from inside that armor, and what the armor could not give them was real. And the reality of the gap does not diminish the reality of what the armor was protecting. And the reality of what the armor was protecting does not diminish the reality of the gap. Both are real. She was not a monster, and she was not a saint. She was a person who had been afraid at 16, and had converted the fear into the most sustained, disciplined, institutionally consequential response to fear available in her particular circumstances. And the response had produced what it had produced, and the cost of what it had produced was paid by the people closest to it. The institution is still here. That is the plain end of the story. The House of Windsor, named in the name change she quietly engineered in 1917, is still the Royal House. The Royal Collection, built across the 60 years of her adult life through the mechanism that made housekeepers move things overnight, is still held in trust for the nation. The Queen she prepared in the months between her second son's death and her own, who held the crown for 70 years and died having served it as completely as any monarch in the modern period, is gone now too. What May built outlasted her. It was always going to outlast her. That was the point. The institution she built is the institution that exists now, not unchanged. Nothing that lasts is unchanged, but continuous in its essentials, in the specific combination of public function and managed interior that she had established as the standard across 60 years of daily demonstration. The standard was demanding. The standard was unreasonable if you apply to it the measure of what most people can sustain across a lifetime. She applied a different measure. She applied the measure of what the position required, and the position required everything. And she gave it everything. And what remained, when everything had been given, was the institution she had served, and the granddaughter she had taught, and the collection she had built, and the 10-week gap between her death and the coronation she had almost lived to see. Almost, not quite, 10 weeks. The institution did not wait for her. It was built not to wait for any individual person. That was always the argument. The institution outlasts the person, and the person's work is only real if it is the kind of work that the institution can carry forward without the person there to carry it. She built the kind of work that the institution could carry forward. Elizabeth carried it forward. The carrying went on. She died in March. The crown was placed in June. The 10 weeks between are the final fact of a life in which the facts were consistently arranged around the single argument she had been making since she was 16 years old in a borrowed house in Richmond Park, that what lasts is what is maintained, that what is maintained has to be built to last, and that the building and the maintaining are the same work done across a lifetime, day by day, with no exception and no negotiation for the person doing the work. She made no exception and no negotiation. The institution is still here.